my heart belongs to you.
That's Mandala.
That reminds me of you know that movie Oh Lucky Man?
Of course, Lindsay Anderson. That's classic.
Yeah, it's got that. I think the guy's name like Graham Parker. He did, like the Animals or something like that.
Yeah, Game Park.
He did the soundtrack for it, and it's like I guess around that time these movies had these like Greek chorus soundtracks where they just like describe all the emotions of the characters going on. It's a weird world, eh?
No, that's good stuff.
Because it's kind of like Superfly. I saw a bit of that movie recently, and it's just like endless shots of cars driving to the soundtrack.
Yeah,
like I guess that's all you can do with that movie.
Yeah. Anyway, we're going to be discussing some albums here today, as per usual. We're not fucking with this formula here.
No.
Although we may be, we're going to be bringing up some some of the famous old art rock dinosaurs a bit later, and that'll be interesting, I suppose.
Dinosaurs.
I was going to say, just because
Dilophosaurus.
I like the idea, because remember the last time we joked about, because I did mention that Marillion would be discussed, and I thought it would be amusing. You know, you mentioned, you kind of read a reference to fashion, my childhood there, misplaced childhood, and I mentioned, oh no, actually it'll be a kind of album which, I don't know why it was just discussed in the context, is oh, you see, Tranquility / Pete Pardo would not necessarily care for, and we'll get to that a bit later. I guess that's an era of the group which doesn't have so much love, although Marillion initially operated in an era which was very unkind to a sort of prog rock zenith. I mean, prog rock's not mainstream now, but like bands can seemingly operate under that, in that world as like sort of a niche act, you know, that like neo-prog festival circuit place.
Anyway.
That's UK context.
We'll get to Marillion.
Yeah.
Marillion.
But even in America, that was... Well, prog never really took off in America, but in any case, punk had its foothold in the States, California.
Yeah, well, only on the coast. Infamously, kind of like I guess the punk you get.
A couple of Ohio bands.
Well, I was gonna say the all the movements. That's sort of the neat thing about this band, I guess. Suburban Lawns, self-titled, one and only album, is that like as much they're like a mishmash of all the sort of underground, like punk rock sort of movements, kind of all across America. Because it's weird. There is that middle America scene that has, you know, heaps of bands, even, you know, south as well, bands like, you know, the Athens sort of Georgia stuff,
of course, yeah.
And yeah, so this band's like, it's strange, it has all the elements, like there's obviously first wave punk in it, there's like that sort of punkabilly, you know, like ex Los Angeles sort of stuff, like I was saying Athens, there's that like B-52s, like kitschy sort of like, you know, 50s sci-fi movie surf thing going on.
Definitely.
There's a band, I think they might be from England, I'm not sure, they're called the Rosillos, that are very similar. And then, like, even bits of, like, out of Athens as well, you know, like Pylon and stuff like that. And then, like, yeah, this album's just, it's like, what, just under 30 minutes long.
Yeah.
Like punchy, like sort of spasmodic, like punk songs, but each in its like sort of own distinct style that draws from all these sort of things. And it's strange that it comes from like 1981 because it feels like one of like if this album was from like 2017, people would call it the first like egg punk album.
Egg punk?
Yeah, egg punk's like this new sort of take on Devo and like Zolo.
Oh, is that like the Coneheads?
I suppose so, yeah. They'd be considered egg punk, yeah. Yeah, they're a kind of funny little group.
I love that album,
yeah. That's a thing that's sort of become popular, again, similar to, like, you know, the third post-punk revival.
Yeah.
And it's, like, the more sort of, you know, arty mixed with, like, kitsch, you know, popular culture reinventing itself sort of thing. Let's say, like, I don't know, strange Zolo groups like the Oingo Boingo I like, or Devo themselves. Yeah. And it's weird that this is an album from that era, because to me it feels like it's like a retrospective thing, but somehow was made at the time. Huh. I think these guys had a very weird, sort of peculiar, very eclectic way at looking at punk, And it doesn't surprise me that apparently this was the only punk band that Frank Zappa liked.
Oh, was that
Yeah, or like he said it was his favorite punk band.
What's the source on that, actually?
I'm not exactly sure. I read it on Wikipedia, but I think I've seen because they played on like SNL or something.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
That's how I was first introduced to this band. Was them playing the funniest shit song on this album, Janitor, on like SNL or one of those things. And I swear I seen even Frank Zappa on like one of those broadcasts, being like, "I love this band." So yeah, it's very interesting. It's like it's like, you know how some of this sort of art punk stuff can get a bit out there. It never goes completely into that territory. It just still works within the drive and the range of essentially first wave punk and like the sort of shorter, like punchier post punk that was really early on, you know, like early Susie or something like that. So it never sort of like extends itself beyond those boundaries. It works within that like parameter, but does it in such a unique way that, like I said, it feels like it's out of time even.
Yeah. Yeah, just to clarify, Suburban Lawns, it was a group that Zappa did seem to like. According to Wikijawaka, they have a little segment.
Oh, nice. You can hear why, right?
Yeah, it's a sardonic sense of humor.
Yeah.
California-based, yeah.
Yeah, and just full of like... One thing they do have that is sort of Zappa-esque and from that more progressive world as well are all the odd time changes and stuff in the songs.
Yeah.
Like all the riffing and rhythms are fairly simple, like I was saying, within that sort of parameters of first wave punk even. But then all the time changes and things like that are what sort of make it feel unique and sort of like almost like a bit like the Minutemen even, which is another like I was saying, it just seems like this band somehow had a lens into the future, and they had the internet at the time and they were listening to all these bands and retroactively, but instead they were there somehow. It was their unique brand of, you know, creativity. And it's just a fun, short, classic sort of punk album. It's like kind of what you want. And I always have a fun time just sort of listening to this one back and back, because, you know, it's when you want like a sort of experimental punk, like a Zolo thing that just doesn't quite go too out there. You know, you can listen to it walking around and stuff. So it fits those two worlds quite nicely.
Mm. It's more accessible sometimes of Swell Map songs.
Yeah, Swell Map, sure.
And you said third post punk revival before. What was the third revival? Because it was the first one in the 2000s, right?
Oh, I guess post punk
Second.
revival 2/3 wave.
Yeah, I hear what you mean. I thought you meant that. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah,
Am I forgetting something? This is like one of the. Yeah, I think this is probably one of the best things that's been offered on Mandala so far. I'd never listened to Suburban Lawns before. I'd heard the name mentioned and I thought, oh yeah, it might be one of these like little groups at the time, you know, like sort of a... I imagined for some reason I thought it might have been an English group, and you know, one of these groups with like a low budget and sort of a thin sound, but it's quite it's a relatively dense sound for what it is.
Yeah.
And no, it is a more sort of crazier bend of punk. It feels like more something of like the UK's world, where it is operating in California in terms of, you know, some of the sonic residue of what I'm hearing. And it almost seems like not quite as abrasive but prototypical of UK groups in the death rock dimension.
Sure.
Like Alien Sex Fiend, which is just some great stuff there. So yeah, no, I this is fantastic, and it's I guess it's a bit of a shame, but you know, there's nothing else. There's an EP as well, apparently.
Yeah,
I've not heard that yet.
Which is added on to like apparently reissues of the album.
Cool. But no, I guess this group just called it quits, and according to this, 1985, the one Sue Tissue of this group has another album in 1984 called Salon de Musique, and it's quite well rated here. I might check that out at one point. Oh, it's a post-minimalism record.
Yeah. I don't know much about that one. I haven't heard it, but it's got like a fan base, seemingly.
Very nice.
Yeah, and I think she was in like a Jonathan Demme movie or something like that, weirdly enough.
So was one of the later picks, a very subsequent pick actually.
Yeah.
Well, he had a concert film in the late 90s directed by Jonathan Demme.
Okay.
I've not seen it, I just know of it.
Okay.
It's called Our Storefront, and it's the person's surname.
Sure,
a famous film director.
Okay.
The surname belongs to it.
Sure.
Anyway, no, this is strange little thing, and also I just want to comment on the visual, the cover art here. It seems like I'd love to like take this to some like professor of modern visual art and say like, so where's this style like stemming from? Because this looks like industrial music album art from like maybe the UK, Test Department, that sort of world in the mid 80s, and I'm thinking like, what's the genesis of this sort of like it's sort of like graffiti kind of looks like what someone would do with digital and Photoshop now.
Yeah.
But, like they've achieved it and thought of it in the first place via like totally analog circumstances. Like is that? It's like meant to be TV static. Like I mean like
yeah,
like a very like it's like a photograph they've gone crayoned on. It's just.
Yeah,
it's a very interesting visual. Like,
yeah.
Where does that come from in 1981? But that's not cliche in 1981 yet. That's just really interesting. A visual.
I guess another way that they're sort of plucked out of time.
Yeah. No, this is just some record. As you said, it's actually 28 minutes. 1981, California group, Long Beach specifically, formed 79, disbanded 1985. Yeah, this is. Yeah, I'm gonna say this is. I've never listened to this before today, and it's some of the most immediate and just like viscerally catchy of and memorable of the punk oriented recordings I've heard. There are like maybe 3 tracks on here. I'm just like, wow, like the moment I hear these a second time, these would be just instant hits.
There's a bunch of classics, yeah. Like Anything, Janitor, Not Allowed. Yeah, man. They're pretty much all the songs are nuts as well. And
there's another album that has that quality, and it's also a post-punk album from 1981 in the UK, is Orpha by Scars.
Oh, that's a great
masterpiece.
one.
It also has an odd looking. It's a mask specifically, but a face on the
cover.
It's
like that South American Day of Death design or whatever.
Oh yes, of course, yeah.
In like a 3D sort of representation, if memory serves me correctly. Yeah, it's a cool album.
Yeah, that album's just godly actually. Anyway, Suburban Lawns, self-titled. God, if Mandala's going to becoming a punk show from now on, then so be it, because this is. Tranquility's not going to cover the fucking genre. I guess someone has to, and not from like an American perspective. Hey guys, this is my Black Flag shirt, and the pop punk in the 90s. Well, the thing is, and it's like it was garbage. Lagwagon.
Pennywise. Man, it's such a particular person. The people who listen to bands like that, they only listen to those bands in the sort of punk canon or whatever. They only listen to bands in the punk canon and no other music.
Yeah.
It's strange.
Yeah, because the old school punks listen to like actually almost like God, that they would sooner listen to pop music and disco than they would like hard rock, arena rock sort of music.
Sure.
Like it was an interesting sort of like that was sort of punk. It was more about being anti-rockist in a sense, not just being like a certain category of Rolling Stone magazine.
Yeah.
As like sort of Green Day world basically is. And it's just if Mandala's going to be a punk show, then and there's not going to be no Party's Punk Parade or whatever that thing was last year, April Fool's thing. then so be it. If we're just going to get quality releases like this just flooding in.
There's a lot, yeah.
And I can't get into metal, but we get things like this to satisfy me. I was thinking, not being able to get into heavy metal. Like I was into like kind of the primordial sort of basic heavy metal acts in my adolescence. And I still am. I've talked about it on the show, but I always thought I would at that time would get more into like the metal as a wider phenomenon, because there's so many genres and bands and like variety of things, and I would. But then it kind of left me a bit cold. And, you know, like, you're an angry, kind of relatively reclusive adolescent. Like, you think, of course, this music's going to appeal to me. You know, we're outsiders, we're rebels. But, like, it didn't... I was like, oh, the music's just not that interesting to me. But then, like, the sort of post-punk, more 80s industrial music, I was like, yeah, this... which I'm more listening to as an adult. I'm like, yeah, this is kind of what I wanted. More so.
Sure,
These sort of bands. Like, and not even, like... And by punk, I mean more like the... more artier sort of punk bands. Not necessarily... I mean, I did get into the Sex Pistols as, like, a bit of a later adolescent, and The Clash and Dead Kennedys and a couple other things. But those sort of bands were... how I grew up, those bands, a lot of the first wave sort of influential punk bands were a bit of like a t-shirt category, and they didn't have the same sort of impact.
Clash, they all became t-shirts.
They didn't have the same impact to me, and plus, like, they weren't as experimental or punk as the ones later.
Exactly, and the first wave of punk, those bands, you know, the Clash, the Pistols is the obvious example. Like, they operate in the entertainment world of distribution, the same world that, like, metal bands typically do.
Yeah.
Like, they have a completely different ethos to, like, the punks that came along later.
Yes.
The DIY ethos and the, you know, we'll make it ourselves, try to distribute it ourselves, organize our own gigs, operate outside of what the equivalent of, like, Ticketmaster and the managers were like back then.
Yeah.
You know, they wanted to work outside of entertainment, essentially.
Yeah.
And so that's where you get that philosophical difference or artistic difference in what the actual content of the music is and the albums and stuff, is because, you know, it's trying to operate within its own world, not within the world of entertainment, you know.
Aye. And, yeah, some artists managed to...
Like, when I was a teenager or late teenager, like, I'd listen to this album working at a fruit store, and all these, like, middle-aged co-workers were like, what the fuck is this kid, like, doing listening to music where a woman's gargling? You know? But, it was so visceral and, like all-encompassing. It was great music. So.
Yeah, it's terrific. But in regards to what we were saying about the kind of those commercial avenues which artists sometimes feel obligated to still travel down, I guess sometimes they achieve a degree of enough of a loyal fan base or critical fervor that they can maintain a degree of commercial stability, releasing fairly prolific discographies, especially when you can be sort of a domestically popular artist or have a cult following in a densely populated country like the UK. Someone like Robin Hitchcock, formerly of the Soft Boys, who are a band which I never ended up quite getting into the Soft Boys, but I feel as though one of these days I might end up doing so. The Soft Boys had a degree of commercial popularity and some mild critical fervor, although apparently they were a bit too neo-psych for a lot of the magazines at the time, the trendy magazines at the time.
Sure, yeah.
And so they wound up being sort of pushed aside, although they had some degree of commercial success and the cult fan base at that loyal group following them at that point.
Yeah.
And then Robin Hitchcock, after 2 albums, Robin Hitchcock left, and has quite a number of albums since that time. I Often Dream of Tramps in 1984, this is what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
This is the 3rd release of 32, ultimately, which Robin Hitchcock has
32
put
albums.
out since 1981.
That's pretty impressive.
I came across I Often Dream of Trains, I believe, because it was on some list of best albums of the 80s or 84 or whatever it was, and this has maybe been like 8 years ago now.
Oh, nice.
When I got into this, and I found that this is strangely dense, odd odyssey of songs, which all seem to... What I found really fascinating about Robin Hitchcock actually is he said he devoted his career, at least his solo career, being what he describes as Barrett-esque.
Well, that was going to be my first citation.
Yeah, and I find that compelling that someone tried to put together one of these LP odysseys via that sort of style, and it's just under 40 minutes, this whole thing here, and as opposed to something of, I think this sort of music's more conducive to sometimes LP era run times, because you know, when this is CD and they just kind of plop 15 songs on, and they were just sort of there.
Sure.
And they expect people to listen to it in the car or in like the background of like the fucking living room or whatever.
Yeah.
Not in like, you know, a more intimate sort of
It's less immediate
session.
Yeah.
And so they're just like, we'll just chuck songs on there. And they just treat like, it's like every CD was almost treated like a fucking compilation almost. In the sort of that sort of sequencing. And so I often dream of trains has me imagining that, God, like the CD era equivalent could have been far less interesting, because you get, I mean, what you have here is a defined segment of songs which are, this album is a fantastic argument for sequencing in a way, because I can't imagine this being as effective in a different order if you put certain songs of a certain ilk closer to each other, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's definitely very tightly sequenced. I couldn't agree more.
It's really all over the place. He has a very... It's like he has spots of very clever songwriting and spots of very more straightforward statement esque songwriting, and it's almost like he's doing that very deliberately, because you know he's capable of very pretty rhyming couplets, but it's almost as though he's insisting upon these statements, which does seem slightly punk or Lou Reed.
Yes.
It's like that's coming through, as well as a bit of Syd Barrett. He's an interesting side of, as opposed to someone like Martin Newell, who's all melodic.
Yeah.
Or maybe there's some punk elements thrown in there, but I mean, someone else can tell me that, I guess. This feels more closer to... It reminds me slightly of the Dog Bowl Fellow, some of the more American wannabe neo-psych guys of the Slacker era. This is almost, it sounds like it could be a Slacker album in the earlier 80s in the UK context. And it's funny that Robin Hitchcock had that sort of neo-psych aspiration, because I feel like the neo-psych sort of maybe dissolved a little bit here, and it's given way to... Well, apparently another big influence on Hitchcock was Bob Dylan. And so this sort of 60s iconoclast, sardonic ethos is I think highly apparent throughout this as well. I think what we have here is an album which, from when I first heard it, I just found it highly stimulating and quite likable. And I've always felt as though I need to somehow either listen to it more, give it some dues, more so. And Mandala is the perfect platform for me to do so. That's I Often Dream of Train, Robin Hitchcock. I can probably speak about it a little bit more, but I'll hand it over to you, just for now at least. Yeah,
no, that's definitely a good vehicle for this album, because, this album is fucking awesome. Because it's like you mentioned, obviously, a clear Syd Barrett influence. But the whole time I was just listening to it as if it was quite clearly Syd Barrett with its, but less of the English whimsy and this whole new angle on it, mixing it in with the sort of, gothic, almost like haunting Joy Division, but in London, like Ghost-esque. It's very gothic, and it's got a great title that completely sets the mood for... songs that flow in such strange ways, but I couldn't imagine it being sequenced in another order, because it feels very particular, and when punks do concept albums, it feels like it, especially up to this quality, when it's less, when it's not like didactic, it's completely natural and organic, It sort of just always has this atmosphere, and I think that's the sort of the nature of the best sort of gothic music of that era. And I definitely lumped this album in with like a bunch of those sort of great albums, and like similar to a band, a pick of yours that we'll get to toward the end, which is also of the era. It feels more like it's with, like you said, you described it as being very punk. It's within that punk world of like independence and auteur sort of creativity, as opposed to trying to, like the band later, very successfully, force your way into the mainstream lexicon, which they did in the 21st century by putting, shoving their album on everybody's electric device. Oh. But, that came along later. Yeah. yeah, this feels like it's in that earnest world of just like raw creativity and experimentation in a bunch of different forms of post-punk pop music essentially.
Yeah.
And I just love the best way it encapsulates the sort of gothic Sid Barrett is like one of the early songs in it. I think it might even be the first song after the intro. Has that classic chorus about how he wished he was like a pretty girl, so he could pleasure himself in the shower. I was like, man, that's what a lyric. That's hilarious.
Yeah, it's kind of lyric that if Lou Reed would put on a record if they would let him get away with it. But
Yeah.
Lou Reed was always signed to like fairly major labels, so they probably wouldn't let him do it.
Yeah, it feels like and it's full of like strange sort of emotional narratives and sort of peculiar like human skeptical lyrics like that, which really makes it feel like it's comes from a sort of a real place of artistic expression. You know, it doesn't feel like there's any like false like artifice to it. It feels like an artist's raw expression.
Oh yeah, some like there's that songs like Uncorrected Personality Traits, which is one of the best aged songs. Like I mean, oh my god,
that's
like,
a funny song. Yeah,
that's like, you know. That's the kind of song that someone would put out sardonically now, but like it just makes you think the zeitgeist mustn't have been that different then.
No, because that's the other thing I forget to mention. It's also within the new romantic era, and it's responding to a lot of the sort of cultural sycophantic aspects of said era, but also an embrace of that sort of the gothic sort of it's weirdly like it's like a romantic take on nihilism.
Yeah.
And that's what a lot of new romanticism was. And it feels like it's operating within that world. It's interesting that when the concept of something like woke worked its way into the international lexicon.
Yeah.
Like a guy I knew from the new romantic era who I work with, he was like he brought up like it as a concept or whatever in relation to like I don't know transsexuals or something, and I was like, wait, didn't you like used to DJ at a club with makeup on? And he's like, oh yeah. And he within that perspective, he just remembered his youth, and he was like, yeah, that's. It was exactly the same as now, essentially, and yeah, this album definitely is like one of the best sort of like new romantic era albums I've heard.
Yeah, it's terrific to have records like this in the bracket of acclaimed releases for its year at least. It's listed as 140th best album of 1984.
Nice.
On Rate Your Music, which is it's nice to see, but yeah, it's I guess just pleasant that someone could put this out and it would attain quite a substantial fan base. It's not often that we get. I mean, this is the sort of thing that might be on an outside label and not be heard in, some years later. But no, we've got it. And Robin Hitchcock, and he's got the Jonathan Demme film is Storefront Hitchcock.
Okay.
In the late 90s, although I don't know much about it. I'm just looking here.
Oh, Hitchcock, right. He made movies.
Yeah, I'm looking at the top 10 albums of 84 on here. And it's Metallica's Ride the Lightning, Cocteau Twins, Treasure. I've always found them overrated compared to a lot of these other bands. Maiden's Power Slave, Ava Parts, Tabula Rasa. It's totally minimalism. Chicago Symphony Orchestra, Symphony No. 9 from the New World Classical release. No Double Nickels on the Dime. Songs from Suicide Bridge, David Kaufman and Eric Kabor. Husker Du, Zen Arcade. The Replacements, Let It Be, and the Smiths. I often dream of trains over most of these, with the exception of, I mean, maybe on the par of Zen Arcade.
Yeah.
To be fair. Yeah,
No,
just Zen Arcade.
I'd put it up there.
Double Nickels is good too.
I'm a big
Very
fan
good.
of Double Nickels, Zen Arcade, Let It Be, and what was the last one you said?
Oh, the first Smiths album. That's certainly a good album.
I like all
I
those.
prefer the later Smiths albums, and Hatful of Hollow.
No, all those albums are kind of like considered alternative classics, and to me, I personally really like them, and I'd easily put this album amongst those, definitely. Yeah.
No disrespect, the Metallica and the Maiden, those are both good. That Ride the Lightning in particular, that was as good as Metallica.
Ride the Lightning is a fucking sick album as well.
Oh, yeah,
that deserves to be in the top 10, sure, why not?
I have so many albums from 1984 I like. It probably would never be in my top 10, but
sure. I guess I'm thinking more the general consensus top 10.
Fair enough.
Like, you're not disappointed. Whereas, like, I don't know, various other things, you're just like, what's that doing there?
Right, yeah. One of those things.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, no, great album, this one.
I suppose now it's time to move on to New Zealand. We do that occasionally on this show.
Apparently every week.
Also 1984, by the way.
Yeah, nice, same year. People should go out there and kiss the ring of the independent music overlords. The New Zealand scene, car crash set, no accident.
Yeah, no car seat headrest or a car crash set.
Yeah, man, car seat headrest. That's the weirdest name for a band ever.
Yeah, the music's not very good either.
No, I haven't heard much, but yeah, just sort of taking the 90s lo-fi pop sound into Ed Sheeran territory. As opposed to Car Crash Set, which is taking, I don't know, what would you say, Kraftwerk / like, I don't know,
New Order's sound.
Wave, New Order, yeah, obviously the first song is, doesn't sound like Blue Monday at all. Yeah, and mixing it in with, it's strange. Apparently, I did learn from, that New Romantic mate, that all these songs, like half of them were recorded at one time and the other half were recorded at another time. Most of the more electronic ones are mostly just like sort of the one guy, and then the songs that sound like they're, I don't know, weird like Zolo-y dance punk numbers, like even like the third song, Breakdown, sounds like it's like what's that Frankie Goes to Hollywood or something. It's like that sort of early 80s, like, and apparently these guys are like big fans like DAF as well.
Oh.
Which is sort of, you can hear in those sort of band songs, because like I think that Mussolini song was a big hit in New Zealand.
Oh yeah.
And so this like it's apparently this guy, he owned like the best keyboard in Auckland at the time or whatever. Yeah. And it's sort of evident in the sound, because it's mixing all those European and English, like early electronic music into its own unique sort of post-punk, down under sort of style. And I feel like weirdly successful at that. This guy feels like a sort of like a very like weirdly accomplished songwriter. But like all the songs are just like, once again, similar to your previous pick, like strangely like gothic, the less dancier ones. And it almost feels like, sort of like the Chameleons-esque thing mixed with like OMD or something like that. And there are all these strangely like yearning songs about like, I don't know, post-adolescent like romanticism. And it apparently I did learn from my mate that all the songs are about like this one woman. And it feels like that, but it makes me think that a lot of these like
Sax Appeal?
Sorry?
Even Sax Appeal?
Sax.
There's a song called Sax Appeal.
Oh, nice.
I know Barker. You know that song?
Yeah. I didn't know I don't know the names of the songs, except for the one called Heart of Stone in the middle of the album. That's like a weirdly, like it reminds me of something like the Chameleons, like I said earlier, mixed with OMD.
Breakdown's just called Breakdown, right?
Yeah, that's called Breakdown.
Oh, it's about just some dance word to
dance
song.
Because it's a strange mixture of like particularly written songs and it's sort of just like dance punk jams. And I only listened to this album recently, but I just keep listening to it because it's weirdly like sort of strangely appealing. Like there's something fascinating about it. Like I heard a few of the tracks off of it like quite a while ago when my mate was first showing me it, but like I didn't really see the need to listen to it. But then the first time I listened to it in full fairly recently, I was like, man, this is just another classic album from this weird canon of New Zealand music. And it's so strange that if it weren't for like, I guess, distributional factors, I feel music like this would be, even though like I was saying earlier, it is sort of derivative of styles that had just been sort of first invented only years prior.
Yeah.
But it like it feels so much more accomplished than a lot of the other like sort of stuff derived from things like New Order and stuff like that. It feels so particular and similar to Robin Hitchcock, like a very realized sort of artistic vision. And I suppose when like it just reminds me that these sort of things can come from all places. You know, it's and almost in a strange way, especially when it's not coming from like I guess like I was gonna say L.A. My previous pick was from L.A., but I guess that was the more university underground thing, less the Sunset Boulevard, entertainment quarter or whatever. And yeah, I guess I just feel that albums like this remind me of how these sort of expressions can come from anywhere, and it's more the sort of due of the listener to find them rather than to have this sort of stuff force fed to you. And yeah, it's just a sort of an album I really enjoy. What do you think?
I didn't. Oh, this is fairly good. Another group that, on the Australian end of things, there was Coup d'etat from 1985, for self-titled, 86 I think, their self-titled album, and there was another New Zealand group was The Body Electric, right?
Yeah, The Body Electric, whom I say made also knew that guy. He eventually outbought this guy's keyboard, and he bought the Fairlight,
right?
Because of like a car accident he was in.
Okay.
Which is strange that this band's then called the Car Crash set. But that car crash is like a weird butterfly effect. If it weren't for that car crash and that guy couldn't get a Fairlight from a payout, then the world wouldn't have How Bizarre by OMC.
Nah, that thing.
Yeah, because the Body Electric guy is the guy who made OMC or wrote that song or whatever using his Fairlight.
The when listening to this album though, I almost felt as though sometimes the arrangements were a bit on the thin side, and that it was maybe a bit repetitive, and sometimes the songs felt a bit long. And then if I was gonna say if the songs are shorter, the album would be too short. The album's about up to nearly 40 minutes or something. It's but yeah, like one thing I did do, I listened to this album. I acquired a copy and listened to it on my phone outdoors, and then I think I suspect. No, yeah, it was in the slightly different or wrong track listing. Like the songs didn't correspond to titles, and so I listened to it through mostly again on YouTube, and the YouTube uploaded a couple of other songs, like a single and a B-side attached to it, and those I think the songs I enjoyed more almost. Like the single was like this was for a single. If it's meant to be a single,
yeah. Well, they got a bunch
pretty
of
experimental single for what it is.
And then there's like a few compilation albums from like the 2000s that reissued songs that like sort of weren't on this album. That weirdly enough, like a German label reissued them.
Okay.
So seemingly that's the only place that's sort of receptive to this group is Germany.
Yeah. I mean. Yeah, maybe because the technology was so new at the time, especially in a place like New Zealand, just having that technology on the record felt like such a massive moment. But maybe in retrospect, it doesn't feel as loaded with moments, just intricacies and ideas as some other albums of its ilk. I mean, it's still likable, but no, I mean it didn't. I listened to it after the Suburban Lawns, and I remember not that it's necessarily similar acts, but I thought Suburban Lawns was a lot more invigorating. Although this is perfectly fine. I got no major no gripe with it. I'm just describing just observations, I suppose. Preferences really. I mean 84 is like. There's some other albums from 84 I like actually. I'm not necessarily similar to the previous. Well, maybe the previous, not necessarily the previous one actually, or not all similar to this either. But 84 is also the year of King Crimson's Free the Perfect Pair, Rush's Grace Under Pressure, which we've talked about before, Echo and the Bunnymen's Ocean Rain, and Sparkle in the Rain by Simple Minds. Well, that's maybe more contentious to some extent.
Yeah, well, you're talking about albums that have like hundreds of thousands of dollar budgets.
Of course.
As opposed to an album that was probably made for like $5,000, you know.
Oh yeah. I just wanted to throw those out because we were talking about the '84.
Oh no, they're all great albums. Yeah. But it's a different thing. You know?
Of course, that's fair to say. But definitely likable to a degree. I guess I'll pause myself for here.
Yeah, no, that's true. Like in as far as the sort of dancey songs are like extended sort of jams, but I suppose why I enjoy the way it sort of fits into the album is that it's, I guess once again a case of sequencing where it's sort of you can see the seams of it. Like before I realized there were songs that were recorded 2 different sessions, I could tell.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, because it's fairly obvious, and so I sort of found it neat how it would have those, like at least after the jams you'd get some sort of incredibly like melodic, dancey, like minimal synth sort of song.
Yeah.
And I just sort of enjoyed the thing that this album was going for. Though it's, like I said, an album I've only probably listened to for the first time about like a month ago.
Yeah.
As opposed to like something like Suburban Lawns. I would have first listened to that album like 10 years ago or something. So it's something that like, very intimate with. Whereas this is more like of a growing thing.
So, Lawrence, did you just discover that on YouTube 10 years ago? Or?
Yeah, there's like a video of them, which was like semi-viral, of them playing on like SNL or something, doing the song Janitor.
Right, yeah.
And it's like, it's awesome. I was just like, this band is next level.
Right.
Or at least, very interesting.
Awesome,
So
yeah.
listen to the album.
Yeah, that's an interesting, cool formative time to be exposed to something like that. When I was, if I may attempt to, sort of haphazard segue.
Yeah, Homer Simpson, when you were 17.
17/18.
Listening to, instead of Queen, Marillion.
I'd gotten my listening to Queen out of the way. I'd been familiar with Queen since I was a kid, and I listened to some of the albums when I was like a mid-adolescent, like in full whatever, rather than just the hits. And yeah, so I've got familiarized myself with Queen at that point.
Before you start on this album,
Yeah.
Anarachnophobia.
Yes.
Can I just ask one question, or 2 questions? Why Kenny? There's a lot of Kenny on the album cover. I do enjoy
popular
that.
show at the
Those
time.
are like the clones of him that keep appearing or whatever. I suppose.
Yeah.
Mixed with Super Smash Brothers, like alternative coloring.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. But apparently the Anorak thing is like tied into like a jacket or something.
The anoraks are what those jackets are called over there.
Yeah. But I guess the next thing's not a question, it's just a statement before you start on the album. I just want to say progressive rock, Genesis, Fish, heavy metal, dinosaurs, predictable concept album.
I know what you're referencing.
But yes, go ahead.
So I got into this, it was a acclaimed album from 1985, somewhat acclaimed, and in the progressive rock circles, it's Marillion Misplaced Childhood, and so I got into that album, and the first album, Script of a Jester's Tear, but I like Misplaced Childhood a lot more, and over the years I kept being into Misplaced Childhood. I was like, that's a good album, and I didn't know much about the rest of Marillion. I think I listened to a bit of it here and there, and at one point I decided to just kind of try and go through the whole thing, and so I'm just going to go through my opinions on Marillion at least up to this point in time. So I really like the first album, Scripture for Justice Tear, good stuff, a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Fugazi's pretty good too. Misplaced Childhood, very good. In a way, it's probably still the best thing they've ever done. It's just thoroughly entertaining. It's fun to kind of laugh at it, but just the whole like romanticization of the childhood is so corny at the end of the day.
It's a weirdly like corny album, but somehow works.
It's the conviction. He believes in it.
Yeah.
The joy.
And that's the kind of the
only thing.
The kind of the point as well is that he believes in the corniness, definitely. Yeah,
And
like a child, like
time to go. You think it's time to go? Don't be surprised.
or like is it Paradise Lost or Paradise Found?
Oh, profound.
And you're just like, what? But yeah. Other than that, the music is quite good, and the corny concept does work.
But I've never that into. No, still not so much into Clutching at Straws. That's one of the most beloved Marillion albums, the last of the Fesh era. find it a bit drab. I don't know. I guess it was a drab time for him and the group to some degree, but it makes me feel drab a little bit.
It's drab in comparison as well to the prior album.
Yeah, and I've listened to it, and I just more than once. I just never really had much of a rapport with me, to the extent where getting into Hogarth era, I'd rather listen to the first Hogarth album, Season's End, which I think is fairly good actually. I mean, Hogarth's voice is a bit like he's a very powerful singer, but especially at this time in the late 80s, early 90s, but it's very much like a dramatic sort of arena pop voice. Like he had the choice of being in either The or Marillion. He admits he could have chosen the coolest or the least cool band in the world, and he chose the least. And
Marillion or the yeah, what a particular. I guess he must have wanted to sing, because I think in the he just would have been a keyboard player.
You're possibly right.
Yeah, because I forget the name of the but it's a one guy and his songs mostly. Yeah. The guy who sings as well.
Yeah. Season's End was followed with 1991's Holidays in Eden, which Marillion fans don't like. It was a lot more poppy and sort of pop rock, kind of a lush sound. I actually really like this album. It's like I used to try to compare it to something. I'm like, what would I call Holidays in Eden? And now I know how to describe it because I've gotten into this band in the last year, and they wanted to go for like what a group like Fraser Chorus was going for. It was really arty, sort of seedy, sophisticated, emotional pop. And I really like Holidays in Eden, although it's I mean, not some people are just going to think it's too corny. There's some tracks are just outright corny and just like kind of just not okay. But like, I appreciate Holidays in Eden a lot. I think it's one of the best Hogarth era albums.
Yeah.
Then the most acclaimed Hogarth era album is Brave in '94, and this is way too fucking depressing for me. It's just a miserable album, concept album about like a suicidal teenage female.
Whoa.
And I'm just like, nah. I mean, I just don't think that's not who they are. They're not teenage girl. It's just like, I just think like fans of the band wouldn't like the fucking industrial, sort of Marilyn Manson equivalent, and I wouldn't either. I just don't like this Marillion take either. I just think it's kind of just crass and tactless.
Yeah, wow.
And then Afraid of Sunlight in '95, that's not that great. It's what it is. Strange Engine I kind of like in '97. I kind of appreciate it. Radiation in '98, just a bit more like Radiation in '98 is where they first start sounding a bit more like Porcupine Tree, sort of alt rock mixed with neo prog space rock of the '90s.
Yeah.
And Marillion.com in '99 was when that sound was fully realised to the point where Stephen Wilson produces a couple of tracks. And I really like Marillion.com. I might even like it more than OK Computer, and that's just partly because I know that it makes you feel pleasure that would annoy some Radiohead fans, so that's partly why. I don't know.
Do you like it more than jtoll.com?
Maybe, but I like jtoll.com, and I might even do that on Mandala. I like the first Hull album I do on Mandala Bam.
The .com album.
That's a good album.
Are there any
Mango Flush?
Are there any more .com albums?
There might be like a couple of hip hop albums. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I wonder how much of a trend that became.
Hopefully there's a number we can go through them one day. No, we won't. But no, and then that's '99. And then you were mentioning a couple of shows ago that the groups like Marillion funding their albums from the internet and their fans at this time. Marillion.com, and this is the reason why it's called that. I think that was the first one that was funded by fans.
Okay.
And I think Anarachnophobia was as well, but I could be wrong.
Okay.
And Anarachnophobia 2001. If Marillion had kind of shed their sound to be more sort of Porcupine Tree-esque, in alt rock-esque, post-Britpop Radiohead-esque on those last two albums, particularly Marillion.com, it's gone full force on Anarachnophobia. This is like that sort of arena turn of the millennium. I'll just bring this up. The sort of U2-y sort of like big sound, and they want it to be just like what the popular sort of like rock-oriented acts in arenas in the UK sounded like at this time, and they just went for it. And what I will say about this album is, as far as all the instrumental arrangements go, it's actually a pretty amazing distillation of what prog players can do with that sort of more arty Radiohead adjacent UK alt sound. Like, I don't know if you want to call it post Britpop. Like, I'm actually a big fan of this is one of the most interesting Marillion albums from the perspective of the instruments, and I think I think all the solos and everything to do with that are pretty sweet. I dig all of that. And the vocals, I mean, Hogarth's voice is getting a bit worse to wear at this point, and they're still putting out albums, but you know, even now it's...
I'm not quite sure about what he sounds like on the albums prior to this, but like you just said, U2, I feel like at moments on the album he's trying to emulate like that sort of weird like yarn, like this sort of yelping, you know, singing that Bono would do.
Yeah.
But and at other times he does like a more theatrical, like, you know, harder delivery when they get into the hard rock territory.
Yeah.
But there are a few moments on this album where like it'll be the dreamier parts of it, with where like keyboards and peculiar, like almost jangly guitar stuff is going on, and like folky electric, you know, where he does like this sort of falsetto, and that's when it sounded the best to me. I almost like wished the songs were more in line with that that dreamier styles.
Yeah.
Like and he's only doing like falsettos and stuff like that, and it's a bit more instrumental.
Yeah, there's a little more of that on Marillion.com, because there's a track on there called House, which is the working title was Massive Attack Song.
Yeah, okay.
So that's kind of what, you know, sort of bands they were inspired by. You know
Sure,
what I mean?
sure, yeah.
And,
Yeah. That music was... You can feel it on this album. Like, there are a few, like, dubby bass lines where, like, the second track is just, like, going all...
yeah, chords, yeah.
And, like, the beat is, like, on the, you know, in the James Brown sense, coming on the, like, after... on the backbeat, you know?
Yeah.
So there's a bit of that, and it's electronic, so it is a bit, like, yeah, Massive Attack-y. Those are the sort of more interesting parts on the album, when they're being less, like...
Anthemic.
Like you said, like post-Britpop, or it reminded me of like post-grunge in the sense of like, you know, when post-grunge could go like hard rock around this time.
Well, yeah.
And you know the way the guitars sound, like you've pointed out in the digital era from around this time.
Yep.
Like it doesn't work sometimes. Like at least when I was listening to this album, it reminded me of recently. I saw a thing about those, you know, the garage rock revival bands. When you go back and you listen to all that stuff now, you know how it's just like, the reason it's garage rock revivals because they're going back to that like electric guitar riffing, like the early Kinks or something. And like the early Kinks, you know, that was mostly renowned less so for its songwriting than for its like, you know, visceral like driving. Like they hadn't heard guitars sound like this before, you know, in such an electrified way. And when you hear those like garage rock revival bands, you hear that very scooped out guitar sound right in the head of the mix, just driving it. And it's sort of reminiscent of that age where, like, I feel that sort of just basic riffing style works better within that digital context with the electric guitar. And so around that time, like, it goes back to square one, you know what I mean? So all the intricate guitar stuff and, like, the more, like, you know, when hard rock sounds better in the 70s, when it's this spaced out analog recording, you know?
Yeah.
It just didn't quite translate to this era in the same way that like that's why garage rock sounded new in the early 2000s.
Yeah,
because it did sound new. You know, guitars hadn't cut through the speakers in the same way before, and that sort of more primitive or easy styling suited the sort of, you know, heavy digital recording era a bit more. I guess that's why this album I felt was stronger when it's like those spaced out moments.
Yeah.
You know, almost like space folky and trip hoppy and stuff like that. Yeah. It has some nice moments, especially like the longer songs typically. You know.
Yeah. Most of the songs, all the songs are like the shortest song is 5 minutes. That's
yeah,
which is too long. Map of the World, way too long for what
yeah.
that is.
Was that the ballad one?
She's got a map of the world.
Yeah. That song, once again, it's just his delivery, vocal delivery. That's a bit much.
Definitely.
Like it's not the worst thing. Like it does suit that sort of ballady pop music, but it's just not my taste. I suppose I just liked it when the album was more eclectic. So Marillion had this weird mixture of all those things. I suppose similar to Dream Theater.
Yeah.
Like it's that Dream Theater album is similar in the sense it's like a a mashup of contemporary pop sensibilities
Yes.
with their more eclectic instrumental musical moments.
Yes.
And they have one foot in each, but don't
Yes.
quite ride the line.
Yeah.
You know, that, like, I almost wish they'd lean more into that world of more instrumental.
Mm-hmm.
Though perhaps they wanted to write pop songs and stuff, but you know, it's almost like wanting to have your cake and eat it too, almost. You know, in the artistic sense.
Yeah.
So it's not fully realized. Like, there's things missing.
Yeah.
But like an earnest, seemingly noble go at trying to be very, you know, make something that matters. You get that feeling.
Yeah.
It's just a shame that they let that down with the more like mainstream pop sensibilities, like trying to perhaps like, you know, cut in on the radio or something, have a song, which like for an independent band is fairly noble as well. You know, trying to be like, it's noble that Marillion are the band that crossed that wall. They went from being, I guess, like an entertainment group into this more autorial, independent world where they could have their albums funded by their fans.
Yeah.
Like, that is at least like a great reason that this album exists alone, you know.
Mm.
Very noble venture. And I suppose just a bit too mongrel in its construction, you know. Not fully... I don't know. It's like it leaves a bit to. I suppose that is. It's like the opposite of Misplaced Childhood, where that has like a very concise narrative, or at least like emotional vision.
Yeah.
It's just like you were saying, very corny, tied to childhood and like hallucinations and stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas I guess this album doesn't quite, like, thematically have that same sort of thing, which also leaks a bit into the construction of the music, not just what the songs are about and stuff, you know. A bit like the word I'm not allowed to bring up, Genesis, you know, when Peter Gabriel leaves.
Yeah.
Which is another word I think was on there, maybe. But anyway, Peter Gabriel leaves, and Fish is, like, in this case, analogous, right?
Yeah.
And, like, Genesis get a bit like that, where they don't understand, like, pop sensibilities mixed in with their more eclectic instrumental tastes, and they mash them in a strange way. At least I feel that way about, you know, the first album without Gabriel.
Trick of the Tail.
Yeah, whereas they realize it more thoroughly on the one after that.
Window Buffering is brilliant, I agree.
Yeah.
Duke was amazing synthesis of that sort of thing, art pop, I would say. Like,
Yeah.
the concept, and then they had it's almost like the instrumentals were sequels to the pop songs.
It's an interesting way to weave, like,
Thematically.
prog into new wave. I think that's the greatest accomplishment of that album. It's like it's new wave sonically, but prog songs constructively. You know?
Yeah, some of those songs were amazing, like Turn It On Again and Behind the Lines, Misunderstanding.
Yeah.
And just go into the suite, you know, at the end, nobody must know my name. But Marillion probably wanted to do something similar to that, but I don't know. I mean, I do really like this album, and it's good that you bring up Dream Theater, because Dream Theater on Octavarium in 2005, that's when I like the idea of being someone who's optimistic about the contemporary culture in 2005, which is to say they like those sort of bands being one of those folks, and just Dream Theater's their band, and like you're okay with all the tropes. And if you want to be optimistically okay with the tropes in that window of time, if I want to be, at least, I'll go with Dream Theater, it's Octavarium. And if I want to enjoy one of those kind of corny turn of the millennium arena UK post-Britpop neo-prog-ish bands, I'll go with Marillion and Arachnophobia if I want to sort of blind myself and put myself in that world.
Sure. Like, even like the Map song that you mentioned.
Yeah.
I'd much rather listen to that than something analogous from its era, like Coldplay or something.
Oh yeah, Coldplay is rubbish. Of course we think that.
Well, I'd much rather definitely listen to like a ballad by Steve Hogarth Marillion.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Well, I just want to go through the track. I know this album fairly well, to the degree where I actually only skimmed through it today. I didn't actually listen to it in full, because I've heard this album a bunch of times. I've always been just fascinated by what it was going for.
Sure. I didn't listen to my next pick today.
Almost more than any other Hogarth era Marillion album, though I quite like Somewhere Else is another interesting album. But anyway, Between You and Me is a bit... I think the chorus is the most... It's a bit vocally uneven. I love the instrumental, but like it's... it's just like corny dad rock all the time. Like U2, I don't know. Quartz is a bit better. Map of the World I talked about. When I Meet God is kind of compelling, actually. I like the boldness of that sort of lyric. You know, if the bottle is no solution, why does it feel so warm? I like that that's a lyric. Fruit of the Wild Rose is fairly good. Separated Out, possibly my favourite due to the Freaks reference, perhaps. Group of God, One of Us. Cool song. This is the 21st century. I mean, that's the slower song, but I mean, when he's just saying the name of the song, it's a bit like,
Yeah.
I don't know if I believe him, you know what I mean? Like, it's just like, let's do a song about this, and it's just like, maybe he read the newspaper and it was just depressing him, because that's definitely a theme of later Marillion, is it just feels like these guys reading a newspaper every day and just being like, what's going on?
Oh, wow.
Like, Somewhere Else, and especially the most recent, An Hour Before It's Dark, you know, responding to climate change and COVID-19, things like that. I actually like that album quite a bit. But
COVID ruined my childhood.
There's some odd lyrics there, but you have to just kind of accept them. Then the last track. Oh, the last track's probably possibly my favorite, actually. If my heart were a ball, it would roll uphill. That's a 9-minute sort of trip hop rock. I like instrumentally it's operating in a weird place, and it's almost like a new genre in and of itself, or at least a new subgenre in and of itself. And you're like, what even is this? And like, who's it for? No one. And that's kind of what's interesting about it, because it's just this odd you said the Mongol. Yeah, it's this odd alchemy of things that no other band did this, because no other band was in the predicament of Marillion. There were other neo-prog bands, but including ones of Marillion's era, like IQ and I think Pendragon, who just kept doing neo-prog stuff.
Yeah.
Because Marillion were the most successful of them. You know, they still had some, and getting picked on. They're like, nah, like, and also like, for what it's worth, they've never really been truly neo-prog in the Hogarth era. Like, they're never really, because it's like they shared the Genesis era Gabriel thing with Fesh leaving. Like, even instrumentally, they are going from more sort of anthemic sort of God, it's almost like they're the first on that 90s neo-prog alt-rock train. A Season's End you could interpret as like Gabriel Genesis era-esque. That's the first Hogarth album. But it's just such a different... I think they were deliberately going for a different sound with Fesh leaving consciously. So I think if one neo-prog band were going to experiment with new styles and have that very overt motivation to, it's Marillion. Interestingly enough, but no, that's. I'm not going to discuss in more detail the albums that came out after Anarachnophobia. Maybe one day, but it's just how much time do we need to spend talking about Marillion on this program? But no, I do really like this thing. Is it my favorite of the Hogarth era albums? Marbles from 2005 is probably the best, which is just really good. It's almost like you almost do Dream Theater as good as that sometimes. Like, it's just really good neo-prog. And Somewhere Else from 2007 is it's also good. And the album in 2012, which is called Sounds That Can't Be Made, there's a very powerful song on there which is relevant today. I think it's an 11-minute track called Gaza. A very bold piece of music, and it's good that...
Wow, they've been that contemporaneous.
Yeah, no, that's the thing. That's what I mean by, like, read the newspapers and just sort of like, what the fuck's sort of band. And I do like them, although I like with Dream Theater again. Like, James LaBrie, I'm not a fan of. Steve Hogarth, I'm just not a big fan of his voice. I can look past it, enjoy their music, and sometimes
he does a good falsetto.
No, sometimes the voice is fine, but like it does distract me.
Isn't quite
a number of times.
Yeah, when he goes into hard rock mode, it's not great, and ballad mode is, it's sort of. Pseudo-spiritual, like, yelping. Yeah. I'm going to actually, even though the next pick is yours, I'm actually also going to have a lot to say about it, so you go ahead. Speaking of pseudo-spiritual yelping...
I assume we were done with Marillion.
Well, I was surprised that the Anarachnophobia, it's, I've heard some Steve Hogarth era Marillion, and I was almost mortified. This one was actually, when it wasn't too trying to be contemporaneous of its era, like, it was quite, eclectic and interesting.
Yeah, I have to say, I remember when I put Octavarium by Dream Theater on, I almost expected you to be like, oh man, this is horrible on the when we were recording.
No,
but
no,
then
it's not.
and if so, when I put this one on here, I thought, oh, maybe this one is not. But yeah, it's kind of similar.
No, because
yeah, it's interesting. That one, yeah.
In the case of those two albums, they're albums made by people who are very good musicians and have little nuggets of, like, strangely like tasteful out there songwriting chops. I guess it's just a bit disappointing when they try to be more conventional, you know?
Yeah.
They kind of can't do it as well as, I don't know, someone who that's their shtick, you know?
Oh, speaking of, right?
Speaking of, I suppose, but I guess this album...
in terms of commercial success, because obviously in the Dream Theater,
Yeah,
this case, they weren't commercially successful. Well, what are we going to say about the artistic success?
Yeah, because The Fugitive by Tony Banks is a strange album. I guess I picked this one because I haven't picked a prog album yet. And like you said,
Is this a prog album?
This is leaning into a punk show. Well, it exists within the prog canon. And it's almost like underlooked in the prog canon because of the nature of it. And I feel like almost was I was saying earlier, in as far as like that sort of more autorial world of almost punk creativity. Like this album feels like a properly realized, like, you know how those prog guys all by the late 70s and early 80s move into like new wave songwriting and try to sort of like exercise pop chops, you know. You get groups like Asia and you know, Phil Collins' solo stuff and a bunch of that sort of stuff, and it just feels like it's almost like disingenuous pop songwriting, whereas like in a weird way, Tony Banks on this album somehow like realized that like there are these sort of like very like pop rock new wave-esque songs that are then mixed in with I guess as a keyboardist he's sort of more, you know, minimal experiment by prog's, you know, standards, minimal electronic experimentations with, you know, this new hardware and whatnot. And I feel like those songs are the best songs, but they're mixed in with the pop rock songs in like a very, like it's a stealth concept album in the way that like similar to Rush doing it with Signals, like it's or like Robin Hitchcock with I Often Dream of Trains, you know, like I this album is like analogous to that. It's like the one prog guy who I feel successfully realized a sort of independent vision on a pop album. You know, sort of successfully, or at least organically, seemingly. I enjoy that this album is just full of self-consciousness in the sort of, like he feels like a fraud or a fugitive, like the sort of, the main character of these songs. So it feels like an appropriate title. He's like always on the run and like, he doesn't like understand most things, you know. It feels like Tony Banks is this album in a way. Like I don't know the guy obviously, I only know his artistic output, and I guess I haven't heard Banks' statement, or what little I have heard of them. It just felt more generic, like similar to all the other people I mentioned earlier with the prog stuff. Yeah, the post prog, you know, new wave, except for like I don't know Crimson. They do it in a really experimental, unique way, infamously. You know, a few things, but. Generally, it's Asia and whatnot, right? Whereas this one feels like it's even though there are moments of just like sort of pop banalities of its era, but like I can't be helped but like charmed by some of them, you know. It's it's a weird mixture of you know, the opening tracks like a Police or like Rush-esque, like new wave, like ska song. Yeah. That's a strange one. And then you get like, I don't know, fairly like classic rock stuff, but done with emphasis on the electronics. And then you get tracks like By You is a classic in my mind of like the sort of minimal synth era, like in an OMD sort of thing. And it's strange that this guy realized that. And I forget the name of there's another great, like, the instrumental on this one, you know, like,
That's Charm. Yeah.
Yeah, Charm.
There's two instrumentals on here.
That's yeah. The other one, I forget the name.
30
as well.
Freeze.
Yeah, that's great. But Charm is, like I said, this album's strangely charming. That's a very appropriate title for that song, weirdly enough. And yes, everything about the symbol compositions that are like weirdly dense, and the sort of artistic expression of this album all of it is so like fluid in a weird way, which feels like earned and earnest, in a way that these prog guys going pop typically don't. And so strange that the most modest of all these, like, Tony Banks isn't Rick Wakeman with his cape on and, doing the big show and like...
Or Keith Emerson, yeah.
Or Keith Emerson spinning around in the air playing a grand piano and stuff. Like, Tony Banks, by comparison, is a lot more sort of like modest, seemingly, in his presentation, but musically very, like... strangely tasteful, especially as far as those Hammond files go, the Hammond organ. He never got too like he doesn't get sort of out there with his synth work until like later on when he has those pitch bending stuff, starting with like he probably does it at one point on the England album, but then definitely on Lamb Lies Down there's a bunch of those. And by this album he's doing that sort of pitch bending synth work with the sort of restraint that is less. The bombast was appropriate for the Lambs era and stuff like that. But in this era, he mixes it in a very like an interesting electro pop sort of way.
Yeah.
Which is a style that came after his time, but he was keeping up to date, obviously, and got a lot out of it. Yeah, I guess I just picked this album in the contrarian sense of like it typically wouldn't be spoken about in the prog canon, and
no.
It is strangely enough like kind of worthy of that. I feel, of all things, like modest circumstance, but the diamond. It's a sort of diamond in the rough.
Yeah, like oh god, let's go through let's talk about Genesis for a bit. So, look, I there's those big prog bands of the 70s, King Crimson, ELP, Yes, and what's the other big one that I'm forgetting about?
Well, Emerson, Lake and
Giant.
Palmer isn't a band; they're a law firm, infamously as well.
I guess so, yeah. But the thing with an act like Genesis is they were, God, like King Crimson are more sort of especially in the sort of second Angry era, sort of more abrasive, almost like they're trying to be more wicked and interesting than the other prog, like the symphonic prog at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, have a sort of messianic, sort of hippie, sort of, I don't know, like sword and sorcerer's fantasy novel quality about them.
Yeah.
And then ELP is just kind of all over the place, so into the disparate, the kind of the personalities of the three guys there. And then Genesis were all about like this very distinct sort of Edwardian middle class fantasy vision in line with Peter Gabriel's lyrical content at least, and the other guys seem to be on board with that. It's allowed them to do things just musically interesting within the certain odd genre paradigms. And Nursery Crime, Foxtrot, Selling Them by the Pound, and Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. I mean, that's especially Lamb's, like what an odyssey. And that's when his Peter Gabriel was developing his interests further away from sort of English domestic fantasy and into something more otherworldly. He staged a narrative in a sort of New York underworld environment, and it becomes something of this Hodorowskian cycle into like a bit of maybe Jean Cocteau as well. You think of Blood of a Poet and Orpheus, but then when Peter Gabriel left, Genesis initially tried to kind of meet their archetypal sound with Trick of the Tail, and then Wind and Wuthering is still very English, but it tries to. It's looking at more dimensions within that sound, and then like the ultimate band for people who like to exist in a sort of safe post-war consensus environment. We'll get to the post-war consensus soon, actually, and that UK dimension. And then they were Freeze a bit blander. Sorry,
The bloody UK. Bring back Rishi Sunak.
then they were Freeze a bit blander. There's a few songs in there I love, like The Lady Lies, and I like what's she called, Deep in the Motherlode, and I do like Follow You, Follow Me quite a bit, to be honest, actually.
Yeah, that's a weird bit of lightning in a bottle from them making pop music. That's a weirdly good song for it.
Yeah, infamously, Weather Report apparently really loved that track.
Mm.
And then Duke is my favourite of the Phil Collins era. I think that's a terrific LP, just really magnificent stuff, honestly. Abacam I'm a big fan of. I think it's awesome. I mean, maybe there's a couple of tracks on there that are less interesting. Me and Sarah Jane's a bit boring or a bit long, and Man on the Corners, a mountain pop off described it best. It's a bit housewifey. But all the other tracks, I think, are just adore that. I love the fact that it ends with a song called Another Record, about the melancholy, trying to fill in the void by putting another record on. It's a great final track, meta moment. Like, I had the movie recently, The Who by Numbers, listened to the LP of that, and the final, Roger Daltrey singing, I am going round and round, Peter Townshend's lyrics, his thoughts literally going round and round, both in the metaphoric sense and then on record. Round and round, reflecting his state of mind.
Yeah.
Beautifully. It's great analog.
Well, that album's
physical
very
art.
self-aware and so verbose. It reminded me most of, I might have mentioned it, that Chaser sketch where the guy has a song about being like a prolix songwriter, making these like incredibly verbose songs that are like, the song's just about him essentially. Yeah, that's a weirdly self-aware album.
The last really great album they put out. I mean, we can talk about a couple of songs later maybe, but in terms of full albums, that's the last great Who record. And anyway, so then Genesis self-titled, God, that's like kids' music sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's lovely instrumental work, but the songs can be very hit or miss to just fucking horrible, even Legal Alien, And then Invisible Touch, I like the production, but some of the songs are garbage, but I do appreciate Tonight.
The meta statement song on that album, the Reagan era critique,
Land of Confusion.
It's so terrible.
And then there's Domino, I appreciate. And the Brazilian is one of my favourites of the songs they did in the 80s, actually.
Yeah, that's a good track.
That's ultimate, like, British post-war consensus library music, BBC in the 90s, it's just so cool. And then I love, I like the song In Too Deep when it's in the movie Mona Lisa by Neil Jordan, but if it's on the album, I just like, this is fucking boring as shit.
Yeah.
But, but it doesn't ruin that sequence in the film, I'll just say that. And now let's talk about the solo stuff, actually the two albums I did in the 90s are crap, I don't need to talk about those, we did waste my time, or anyone else's. Actually, Jesus, he knows me and he knows I'm right. I've been talking to Jesus.
Yeah, well, that's just as bad as Land of Confusion. Yeah,
That's worse.
it's the same sort of thing.
And then we've got solo work. Peter Gabriel. We love those first 4 albums, and then So K-Punk, infamously called So's the end of the '60s. Sure, why not? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'll get into So later.
Okay, and then we've also got the Steve Hackett stuff. Some of that stuff's brilliant. Spectral Mornings. They're the most prog of the 5 of them. Some of that stuff's pretty sweet. I'm a big fan of Hackett's work up to the 21st century. I haven't heard the new album yet. People say it's really good with the orca on the cover. It's good illustration, that's for certain. And then obviously Mike Rutherford. I'm not going to go there, actually. Fuck it. I'm not going to go to Mike Rutherford. We'll go to Phil. I almost have a soft spot for the first 1, 2.
The Brother Bear soundtrack.
When you get to No Jacket Required and that horrible, overwhelming drum sound of the studio, and then tracks on there like, "He said I would."
That's the sort of song you can still walk into a supermarket and you have to hear it.
Yeah.
It's incredibly annoying.
I like the now dated but novelty Hugh Padgham productions of the first 3. The songs can be unbearable though, to be fair.
Yeah.
Like even the first album's got like, well, The Sheets Are So Cold and oh, there's some bad slow songs on there. But I Missed Again when he's knocking off the Earth, Wind and Fire or Prince. It's kind of fun.
Sure.
And then, but anything after that, like after 1985, is there's nothing fun. There's the production is just it's not fun, not beat 80s anymore. It's just crap. and now it brings us to Tony Banks. So I really like A Curious Feeling. And Tony Banks, I feel like I also wonder if he's like he's kind of the more he's sort of a brain musically within Genesis. Like he's always there, kind of keeping insofar as like Genesis remains a staple of its older self, even in the trio era. I think Tony Banks has the most to do with that. So Tony Banks may be the most vital member of the Genesis sound in a respect, in terms of the continuity. And
yeah, most likely, because like only him and Mike Rutherford were there for most of the time, if not all the time.
Yeah,
and Mike Rutherford does have his moments.
He's a very good, great bassist.
Yeah.
And some of the songs he wrote are good songs. Where they exist.
And he plays guitar on like the 80s albums. And
those are good. Yeah.
There are a few good riffs there, like
definitely,
know,
yeah.
Infamously, the one on Duke. What's the power poppy sort of
Turn It
song?
On Again?
Yeah, like that's good, like surprisingly creative rock riffing. So he does have his moments, definitely. But Tony Banks seemingly is the glue that keeps it together, yeah.
Tony Banks is... I really, really like... And this actually might very well be still my favourite of the Tony Banks solo releases. And that's... I really like A Curious Feeling from 79. I feel like it's a continuation of his instrumental passages from Wind and Wuthering in particular.
Yeah.
I know the vocal passages are a bit... or overtly bland, but I have a good time listening to A Curious Feeling. I think it's quite... I've always found it just thoroughly moving and just atmospheric, actually.
Yeah, it's got good key atmosphere, definitely.
And then that brings us to The Fugitive. It's worth mentioning there's soundtracks to Michael Winner's The Wicked Lady. Gotta love that Michael Winner. The Soundtracks album is good. Still is... we'll just get to the other stuff later, including the classical albums, I suppose. The Fugitive. I always really wanted to believe in The Fugitive as like this like brilliant statement from Tony Banks, and I do really like the album. I listen to it a lot partly because it does have those really good moments, and partly because I really wanted to believe and kind of engineer it as like this genius thing, and I had an appreciation for just Tony Banks in general. Like I was just fascinated by him and his priorities, and just I was obsessed with like those Genesis albums and his contributions to them, especially the Gabriel era, the classic lineup era, the 4 albums. And so I listened to The Fugitive, and that's how you would have been exposed to it all the time. And it's like in parts it's pretty amazing, but it's also very sort of sterile and conformist in parts. And like I'll just go through the track list if I may. Like This Is Love I find uneven, but there are parts of it that are really strong. Do what you want.
Yeah.
Do what you want.
It's got a good bridge, definitely. Yeah.
Man of Spells. The vocal is Tony's not a good vocalist, but I like where Man of Spells is going. It's kind of it's an interesting track.
Yeah.
It's just gets you from one.
Well, his vocals suit this album because, like you said, some of
in the conceptual sense, I agree,
and also the constructive sense, because some of the pop sort of aspects are sort of clunky, like you were sort of saying on the first track. But the fact that he's not this overly trained vocalist really works with that.
That's punk, I guess.
Yeah, it really does sort of fit that mold. In a way that, when the prog guys go pop, doesn't really...
Well, in prog, Peter Hamill, he was never a great vocalist. From Van de Graaff, he was never a very great vocalist.
No.
And allegedly inspired pop. There's a proto-punk / punk album he did in 75, I think.
Oh, nice.
Peter Hamill. So people he secretly founded punk anyway. But the album wasn't very popular, but maybe some people heard it.
Yeah. Well, that was a sound going around. Like the Modern Lovers.
Yeah.
Like that,
The Modern Lovers in the UK?
I'm not sure. I think they're New York. But I didn't realize till recently the album was recorded in like 72 or something.
Oh, no way.
I thought it was from like 75 or 6, but that's only when it was released.
Yeah.
Weirdly enough.
So they definitely didn't get the lyric from Brian Eno, Taking Tiger Mountain song, the true wheel. We are the lovers.
Yeah.
the modern lovers.
I
Sometimes
suppose-
it's to speculate.
Yeah, that was speculated on. Yeah.
But definitely not if it was from '72.
Yeah.
Well, if they were around before the album came out, then definitely not.
Mm.
We should have just looked at that. Anyway, but no, well, actually, that sort of sound that was developing in the UK, because there was that popular like rock and roll concert, like where Chuck Berry and them came around in like '72
Yeah.
to London, and then obviously the glam rock
Well,
stuff,
I didn't
and then
realise-
bands like Status Quo being huge. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the choir. Everyone knows the choir.
That's the Quo.
And yeah, like Chuck Berry had a hit song in the UK around that time, "My Ding-a-Ling."
Okay, yeah.
How weird is that?
I didn't know that was that late. Okay, I know of that song.
Yeah. I'm like, what the hell? It's absurd.
That's Man of Spells, and then that's going into And the Wheels Keep Turning, which is great. And
Yeah.
there's even bits on here which could have been in other groups, like lesser groups, like just they'd devote the whole song to it. Like there's a section on here, so you do what we must before we turn to dust. And like do like that would have been someone else's there. But there's bits in here that like could have been another song, but they and feature of this song, like a wider, the smaller piece of this song, and it works really well.
Yeah, yeah.
I really like And the Wheels Keep Turning. It's one of the best on here. So and this is one of the songs where the album's living up to the promise.
Oh, sure, sure.
And then Say You Never Leave Me is kind of heartfelt, and I do believe it, but it's a bit boring. And the
It's
It's
probably
4
the
minutes.
most conventional song on the album.
yeah.
Definitely.
And 33 is a really good instrumental. We talked about that before.
Yeah.
And then By You is brilliant. I see a face in the crowd. Do 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 do. That's lovely.
Yeah, that's a very nice song, definitely. Yeah, that's probably the best track on the album.
I like
At
that
least-
and Charm. Yeah.
Yeah, those are the two best songs.
At the Edge of Night, it's pretty good. It's not amazing, but it's not far from. It's definitely not one I feel like kind of oh no when it comes on. I do enjoy it. It's fairly good. Moving Under could be a lot. For the last track, I wish it was more creative. It's a bit. That's more conventional songs. And then there's two other tracks you can hear, which I think from CD later, and one's called K2, and that's almost like a Worse at the Edge of the Night. And then there's another one called, I can't remember what it's called, but it's got that's the worst song on here, if you count those two. The one of the choruses, I'm not talking about mountain climbing. I don't like that song too much. It's not that great in my opinion. I wish it was more instrumental on here, but where it's instrumental, it's gorgeous, and it's a great kind of like pastiche synth sound. It's a bit Mr. Show in a way, but that's a good thing in my mind. Because Mr. Show means it's a great parody that embodies it in a beautiful way while lovingly as well.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Well, like I was saying, it feels like the character on the album feels like he feels like a fraud or something.
Yeah,
In
yeah.
this whole world of entertainment, like his bandmate Phil Collins has somehow become
yes.
and Peter Gabriel.
The
I
balding
guess
drummer,
later
yeah.
becomes mainstream, but around that time he's like critically very acclaimed, and so that sort of just like is personified on the album in a weird way.
Yeah. No, it's a great idea and such concept you can put there, but the idea, the music not always being consistent is kind of the point as well, because he's like trying and sort of it's a bit awkward,
It fits in definitely.
It's lovely.
It's almost the point.
Gorgeously meta in a manner, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I do really like this one, and I'll get to Tony. Like I said, I was going to get to Tony Banks stuff afterwards. Still, 1991.
Yeah.
Okay, this record should just be a fucking meme. Like this is when it's just like too far. You know what I mean? Nick Kershaw does the vocals, and it may as well be Tony doing. No, Tony would have been worse, but oh man, I'm not a Nick Kershaw guy. I guess.
Tony Banks' sellout album is awful.
And then 7 in 2004 is his first classical release, followed by 2012 6 pieces of orchestra, and 2018's 5. 7 and 5, as you can imagine, like 6 pieces of orchestra refer to the track listing, and it's really good classical music. I mean, there's some of the only times I've listened to classical music in my spare time when I wasn't in the car for Classic FM, Sydney, but it's because it's Tony Banks albums. I was like, I'll spend some time with these, and they're good. I like them. I had good times in listening to them, and it's, because I like classical music. I just never feel like listening to it over other forms of music.
Sure,
Because
yeah.
it's the 20th century.
I'm sure Tony
and
Banks
it was
has
the 20th century for several decades.
Yeah,
I just like classical music. Just feels like the period piece music at this point. I'm just like
Yeah.
I'm not that those eras don't I'm just not like music. Even listening to music from the 50s sometimes, like even I like 60s and 70s jazz more. You know what I mean? And the Charlie Parker records from the 40s, from the 50s, excuse me, they're gorgeous. Like the Dial stuff, like that era is fun. The clubs, you know what I mean? It's not conforming. Like I don't like music that makes me think of like 50s suburban life. I'm just like, this is depressing. Like I don't want to be the kid, and I'm the kid and a serious man trying to get the records and cannabis. I'm like, move the 50s on, bring the 60s on. You know what I mean?
Yeah. The bop.
I don't know. I like maybe unless it's just weird like Lynch's 50s, but actually I don't know if I would enjoy that. That's kind of fucked up when it's beyond a screen.
Yeah, well, and that is the sort of bop era. Is that kind of, or this is the grimier, like club bop. It's kind of dirty subcultural world. And for 50s culture, that's why it still sort of translates now in a more interesting way than, I don't know, like a crooner music from that era, or like a skiffle, very early rock and roll, rock around the clock,
Yeah, some of the rock and roll, like I love when those tropes are applied later in glam and other like revival contexts.
Yeah.
There's some tracks in that era which are just good, and some of the Buddy Holly stuff was fantastic. Little Richard, Chuck Berry, You Can't Catch Me, but it's just also very I don't know, just fucking cornball. I don't know, like I don't know what to say really. It's Tony Banks.
Yeah.
Fugitive. Am I going on to my next pick now? Here. So, I mentioned I thought I was going to be talking about the UK post-war consensus era. It's an era when you listen to the radio, you listen to the television, you listen to the BBC, and they're going to classify the world for you. Here's David Attenborough. Here's him going around the world. This is how the world works. Understand. Listen to the government. Everything's so more socialised. Healthcare, NHS. This is all becoming an increasingly more, in a good or bad sense, socialised state, and it's a very, scientifically classifiable reality. Post deity, and there's still a belief in the pride of, English identity, and that's identities now tied to the idea of taxonomy and being, scientifically empirical and having this very refined education and understanding of the world. It's a bit post-empire, but they maybe just try to move on from, the sort of more, I guess, overtly colonial aspect of it, which is nice and fine, but it's kind of subdued under the surface, maybe. And what's interesting about that world is...
Oh, they at least stopped slavery before the Americans did.
Oh, yeah.
And
before, actually.
And the sort of, this post-empire world you're talking about, or at least it'd been built up for a few hundred years in as far as, like, the subversion of traditional power, political power being from the monarchy. But they always sort of, as a way of, I suppose, like, social cohesion or something, decided to have a sort of lip service to that traditionalism.
Yeah.
Even up to this day,
Yeah, definitely.
Which is very much, like, realised in this sort of, BBC, David Attenborough, taxonomical era. It's like a blending of, because between all these like secular derived, from a social government perspectives on the world, you then have a announcement from the Queen on Christmas,
Yeah.
Things like that.
Absolutely. And I when I said I mentioned another post-war consensus earlier, and I kind of extended it to a period including like sort of the 1990s, just basically, pre-mass internet usage / 9/11 / whatever, and you can identify sort of a second post-war consensus in the 80s and 90s, sort of the Thatcherite neoliberal consensus of be good consumers and it's all okay, watch the telly, watch the football, You know, it's all good. It's world peace from now on. The Cold War's over, especially in the 90s. You know, the Cold War's over, and there's sort of this sort of, especially near New Labour, sort of BBC New Labour, sort of like consensus reality. But the thing about the post-war consensus was that was interesting of people. It was one. It was very, at that time, considered, you know, very, you know, sort of socially progressive, and about, you know, governments being able to hand out assistance to individuals in that like sort of kind of ruthless market capitalist laissez-faire sense, sort of the opposite of that. A very, I guess, what they called Keynesian economic ethos, which I guess ended up being a bit financially sort of haphazard in some respects. I guess, you know, they hadn't worked it out and fought it out as well as they could have. Maybe there was corruption involved, who knows. I'm not an expert on that, and it's probably debated to this day. But in any case, what I like about that sort of, now we don't live in a consensus era necessarily anymore. It's all about, you know, post-truth, and there's all these different sources, and there's no state or public. It's hard to discern. So it's a bit chaotic by comparison, seemingly. You know, everyone getting their source from one news outlet channel. But the thing about what was so cool about that era, not the conformity of it, not the sort of conservative consistency of it. To me, what's cool about this era is it's such a potent conductor for weird fiction. And that's why some of that Doctor Who material of the time, or fiction, such as Nigel Neal's The Stone Tape, or just other manner of weird fiction set in the UK at that time, is they're very sort of, you know, idyllic England, sort of post-war peace reality, and then there's these weird incursions of things from other dimensions, Daleks down the street, Cybermen walking down the steps, and they're these things that disrupt our understanding of everything, and it's like, how they're going to classify this, like, where does this fit into the taxonomy? And it's almost like it's scarier, all the scarier.
Well, they mix space ageisms with, like, supernatural. That's sort of, and it's very appropriate for such a drab, like, hyper-conformist society to have that as a sort of, like, you know, retaliatory expression.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there definitely is a certain element in these sort of societies where there can, at least ones that don't censor underground art, it can be a sort of generative process for ideas, or at least like a lashing out at certain, like, conformities. Like, what year is this album?
This came out in 2004.
Yeah, so I guess this is right in the middle of the Bush Blair era, you know.
2005, sorry, but January 2005. So
yeah. Like, it's almost sort of taking those principles into, like, the 21st century.
Maybe,
like, I'm not too sure conceptually, but at least sonically, this album reminds me of something like Mort Garson with Pro Tools, you know. Mm-hmm. Definitely taking that sort of, like, analog synthesizer, sonic landscape, and overall, like minimalist idea, and then draping it into, like, the sort of fairly primitive Pro Tools of, like, you know, early 2000s, right? And it's strangely effective at that, definitely. Like, there's a certain, like, purveying mood over this album that like, appropriately, the cover having that sort of, like, you know, chemical geometry or whatever, it like, maybe deliberately so evokes that sort of, like, sonic imagery, and is almost like sort of, like, hypnotic in that sense, you know. It's a very effective, like, mood electronic album, and weirdly rhythmic as well. But, like, you know, downplayed, not emphasized too much. And a bit, like, bizarre in that weird fiction's a good comparison, actually. Because, within this sort of strict format, there are, like, certain, like, the sort of, like, supernatural world is, like, leaking into the natural world in, like, the Philip K. Dick sort of sense, you know. It very much feels like that, yeah. Or at least it can conjure up that mood pretty effectively. But that might be because of, like, similar to the Dominic Giwe album, like, there's something about that, like, analog synth sound that is so, like, I suppose, like, just iconographically tied into science fiction itself.
Yeah.
But it takes that science fiction, theremin, almost like whirry analog synth trope into like the avant-garde. Into like strange new places.
Yeah, well, and a bit more about the context. It's specifically The Willows by Bilberry Polly is trying to invoke the 1970s and this era of like very strange, say BBC television productions like Pandas Fen by Alan Clark? I don't remember the name of the director or two, but then there's also James McTaggart, excuse me. Alan Clark's different director, but a term that K-Punk Fisher used to describe Nigel Neal's works, it was cybergothic, and I think cybergothic is a great catch-all term to describe stuff from this era. You can even put even Wicker Man into this category,
The remake.
No, the remake that wasn't out yet. The Wicker Man, the 70s film, in the context of that sort of, because The Wheelers is that era of library music.
I thought you were talking about the era that this album was released. But you mean
the 70s,
the Nigel Neal era?
Yeah.
Right.
And like the true, like kind of the high post-war era, the kind of the apex of it, post-war consensus era, and there's a feeling you get from an album like this where the feeling of being in sort of a 70s green England, but like but there's a sort of scientific understanding of the world. There's no elves or fairies or anything like that. In fact, they maybe even asked you to hide under your desk at school at one point for a nuclear bomb, maybe.
Yeah.
And so one day you kind of like go out the back fence or like some place, your relatives in the country, and you're going to go just beyond into the forest, and you just keep going, and it's sort of a weirder world where it's almost as though the natural laws of science become kind of scarier, or the equivalent at least to the old supernatural phenomena, and the world is strange, cold and eerie in a manner that the old ghost fiction claimed in its Judeo-Christian context. Not much has changed. Maybe it's even scarier, possibly. And I gotta say, like, I used to say things like, the last few years, my favourite album, like Taking Tiger Mountain. Before that, I used to say it was David Bowie's Slow. This is the greatest music I've ever heard in my life. Maybe like it's unfathomably gorgeous, and some of the tracks on it, The Willows, and the second track, that's just a self-titled track, and then Kaya Man, the 3-minute track, the third one on here. I mean,
the opening tracks are all killer, definitely. Yeah.
I mean,
it's top loaded with some like top notch electro songs.
I can't believe like the places this sends you to. Like this is like the ultimate, and you wonder. It almost makes you feel envious of that old existentialism of the 70s. I mean, these guys are recording it in the 2000s, but they're obviously aping after something from their very younger years or just before their younger years, and they're sort of trying to emulate that. I mean, the Ghostbox label was kind of what inspired the hauntology term, and as applied by Fisher and Reynolds, appropriated from Jacques Derrida using it in one of his 90s texts, initially coining it. They kind of like bring about, try to invoke these, channel these, kind of these pre-existing eras which were sort of vanquished by the yield of time, although they sort of like linger on like a ghost. They're sort of old ontological scaffolds of the world, which sort of get vanquished by like newer paradigm shifts or sort of adjusted consensuses, let's say. And I have so much. There's so much just overwhelming feelings and tears well up, and when I listen to this album, it's almost like it's as much as I enjoy music in the context of an album, plus just the ethos of it, just it being at the center of that sort of that philosophic angle which you know the K-punk encapsulates most popularly and I guess theoretically as well. It's so it makes me I feel at odds with the contemporary in a way, not overwhelmingly so, but I guess sometimes there's that I like the how the chaos sort of makes one, how it influences and sort of maybe challenges one at least creatively, although I guess it was just there's no real perfect way of having, I guess you say we said having one's cake and eating it too before. There's no way to do that here, because if you were born too early you couldn't necessarily adapt to the era, but being born and raised up in the era you sort of learn to adapt to the idea of every hypothetical criticism and what that might be and how it might influence at least a piece of in my case, you know, filmmaking or film criticism or just narrative fiction in general, writing, screenwriting. I like how that's influenced my works. The stuff I've worked on I feel would be far less interesting without that, and is as a result just, you know, responding to the times anyway.
Yeah.
And anyway, but so but no, records like this one and the feelings that it invokes, it does make me feel like I'm a part of a certain era that vaguely dissipated. Although, not that I necessarily want a return to that sort of world, although I imagine maybe we'll get to a stage where I almost like, I have to admit, I mean, this is a bit very human in a way, but like, you know, just as in, you know, kind of classically unwise, but I yearn for a sort of a kind of Zen feeling with the occurrences and the sort of manifestations within the cultures and arts, and where it does feel like some sort of understandable consensus in its unpredictability, and its like being a sort of like having sort of an aleph is in the Voorhees story planted in one's brain where you can sort of see it all at once, and maybe and better yet, and if I can attain that, maybe it can be transferred to more individuals and we can attain sort of a consensus via chaos unheard of within human history, but worth aiming for just for the sheer fun of it.
Seemingly, as far as like knowledge of human perception goes, what you're describing is akin to like madness or schizophrenia, though. If you know what I mean, like imagine a consciousness, an individual consciousness, trying to grasp the like essentially omnipotence. It's almost against the purpose of individual consciousness.
I wouldn't say it's. I wouldn't describe it as a omnipotent. Like I guess my idea of omnipotent would entail a bit more than that, but I guess it's just.
Well, it's omnipotent as opposed to omnipresent, I think.
Probably, yeah.
I'm pretty sure. I think omnipresence is more like literally being everywhere all the time.
But I'm thinking, you know how like everyone attained a certain degree of scientific understanding by a certain year in human history that was unprecedented prior.
Yeah.
I guess I'm more thinking along those lines. It's like a sense of
That's the great like sort of duality of that sort of like individual consciousness is like human socialization has a capacity for like collective action that, you know, inevitably is down to like the benefit of every individual, so it's like a sort of mutually beneficial relationship, right?
Yeah.
Whereas like seemingly like I would think, I don't know, I could be wrong, but if everybody was in that sort of state of omnipotence or like could see everything all the time, it wouldn't be fundamentally human anymore.
Well, like the knowledge of the sciences, it's a voluntary thing. Anyone can sort of sign up to that. Yeah. But I think for the cultural realm, it's because it's less grounded in it's less quantitative like compared to the material physical reality, the natural science, it's something that's a bit harder to decipher, and it kind of lends itself more to discourse. And I think some of the more considered discourse is a bit more, just given that this is a capitalist economy we live in, a bit more on the fringe, or sort of even more of a voluntary process where you sort of need to volunteer to find out about it in the first place, you know what I mean?
Sure.
Rather than become aware of it, because you don't assume that people or the establishment will be lying to you, because like, you know, you might not be a liar, and so you think, why would anyone else lie? And it's just like, you know, that's well, welcome to heading past the shadow line. What's the reason I bring up the shadow line, which is Conrad's novel? I've not read it, but I've seen 2 adaptations of it, one by Georges Franju, one by Andre Vida, film adaptations. And the shadow line, it's when I saw the films, I saw the shadow, and they're called both called the Shadow Line, based off the text. It's a naval story. It's about a man on a ship, Conrad text, and I thought maybe the Shadow Line was some like a nautical term, or maybe a reference to something like, you know, the flag, the shadow of the flag over like where the ship is. I just assumed that maybe it was in the dialogue somewhere, but I didn't pick up on it. Maybe it's a more known term that I just wasn't aware of. The Shadow Line refers to the opening paragraphs of the novel. He uses the shadow line where the house, or the garden, beyond the garden fence or something like that, in his back or front yard, and going beyond that. And he uses that as a metaphor from, like, you know, child, you know, the excitement of adolescence, going beyond that, and then the subsequent sort of many times described complications of adulthood, and he describes this process as going beyond the shadow line. And I would use that's why I kind of bring that up, beyond the shadow line is I feel that, and in relation to Bellberry Partly, The Willows, is this sort of does reflect you know, that sort of child looking out the window on a rainy day, wondering what else is out there, and in that sort of post-war consensus world, you know, looking at all the taxonomy on the BBC about things, animals in other continents and wars in other nations.
And, history of ancient Rome documentary.
Precisely, yeah.
Stuff like that. Sure.
And sort of like knowing that all these things are myths and not real, you know, think this and that, and then sort of going out in the world and think, what if you do find a little goblin or a giant or a elf, you know, things like that.
Right.
And or just you know, just some weird alien or some spectre, something from another dimension, something you can't explain.
Yeah.
This is it's so difficult for me to explain that I feel like it might I don't want to be too it's the sort of thing, I don't know if it's conducive to speaking like this on the spot as opposed to writing something down beforehand, so I don't want to bore any prospective listeners too much. As a result, anything else to share on The Willows before we go into this sort of encapsulatory record of jangle someone's put together here?
Yeah, I suppose I didn't quite think about it, but yeah, this album is sort of similar to the prior one. Another sunny day, London weekend. An
average person, it's AKA an average person's idea of jangle pop.
I suppose so. It's very twee as well.
I guess twee is the
It's like
people think of jangle pop when they don't think of the Smiths, and
yeah. Like these guys are compared to the Smiths a lot.
Oh,
or at least one of the tracks definitely. The You Should All Be Murdered is called like a lo-fi Smith song or whatever, or like derided for.
Oh,
but one thing I didn't realize till today actually. I always just assumed this was an album, but apparently it's a compilation of from '92, which surprised me because I always just thought of it as a sort of album, and like we've been talking about sequencing a lot. It's like finding out it was a compilation. I was really surprised because the sequencing of this album feels very like natural, and it's strange to think that comes out of a compilation of singles. And I just sort of I enjoy how this album has like it's that world of like very like overly sort of sweet like twee pop songwriting mixed with like the sort of jangle pop thing, but there are all these like very particular songs of like, yeah, I suppose like post-adolescent like yearning in this strange sort of like gothic London, you know, alleyway sort of thing that is at least yeah, it's like a weird case of like hyper emotional twee music actually having a sort of strange resonance with me, just because this guy goes into like weird personal sort of spaces that aren't typically, you know, in pop songwriting. Like even Morrissey would go into those spaces draped in sort of like clever metaphor, right?
Yeah.
Whereas I suppose this album also reminds me a bit of The Fugitive in the sense of it's like these like warts and all sort of like pop songs, and just done in this like sort of like adorable but effective like lo-fi sort of setting where it like I feel like if these songs were like in a more hi-fi setting, they'd be catchy songs, but it would remind me of say like Aztec Camera later on, where they have these very like hi-fi pop recordings, and it just you lose a bit out of that like particular singer-songwriter stuff, the sort of charm that yeah, like once again, even similar to the Robin Hitchcock album from earlier, it has that strange sort of like hyper nihilistic like gothic thing as well, and I just feel that mixes in really well with like, yeah, sort of there's a mixture of songs that allude to that and like these sort of more earnest songs, like a bunch of them like there's one called The Center of My Little World. It's like if that was in a hi-fi production, it probably would be like a hit song, but it almost feels more like earnest and earned in this sort of more modestly expressive format, you know.
Yeah.
And there are a bunch of songs. Like there's one called like What Happened to You, My Dearest Friend. Like that's very similar to like a sort of like a Kingsian thing, I guess mixed in with like the Stone Roses or the Smiths. And yeah, pretty much all the songs are classic. There are a bunch that like sort of really resonate. Like similar to the guitar work is weirdly like reverby and dreamy at some point, similar to like the Stone Roses, the John Squire sort of thing. So it operates in a few different permutations of like jangle pop. It's not just one thing over and over again, which is another sort of enjoyable thing about it. It's got a sort of variety. And I didn't realize the guy behind this ended up joining the Field Mice, which makes a lot of sense because it's that sort of world. And I suppose one way you can tell that he had a at least interesting taste is that one of the album songs that they have that's not on this, I learned like about a year ago. They did a cover of Genetic Engineering by OMD.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting song to cover in like the late 80s.
In that form too. Wow.
Yeah. It's not as good as the original.
Yeah.
But yeah, I didn't expect it to be. But yeah, no, it's just like I suppose like twee isn't for everybody, and it's a very similar to something like slowcore or something. It not requires, but definitely is enhanced by a particular mood, like a cloudy day or something like that, you know. And that's when it sort of reaches its fullest, at least in the pop sense, you know. But yeah, this album has those moments mixed in with a bunch of really sort of creative, simple, sort of like, you know, of the era alternative rock stylings that like I don't feel are like very played, like the sort of things that are generally done like in cliche ways, especially in the 90s, but music like this did those things very naturally and progressed them in interesting ways and would change tempos and do various things, not just be like banal like alternative rock eventually became.
No, I do like this album. It is it felt like I was listening to just such a conscious attempt, or not really conscious. It's just it's someone's, it's like, you know, just if someone was playing like, so they're playing jangle pop, it would just sound like this to me. And I do like that. It's fairly good, and I think if thing about this is there was a couple of songs which both sounded like a bit like the chorus sounded like "Boys Don't Cry" by The Cure.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. Because it also does that. I forget what it's called, but the Cure utilize that in a sort of yeah, they do a similar guitar thing to bridge the riffs. Yeah, that song's called Horse Riding. It's like the Boys Don't Cry if it was mixed with like flamenco guitar or something. So it is a very similar melody. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's enjoyable. I mean, it seems to I don't know if it had as much of an impact on me as some other Django releases I've maybe I don't know if I'm as much of a fan of the... Am I or aren't I a fan of the genre? I don't know. Like, I like that first High Land Hard Rain Aztec Camera album quite a bit.
Yeah, that's...
Obviously, I very much enjoy the Smiths. I gotta see what's listed as C86. I mean, I think that Closed Lobster thing is very good. The Wedding Present in the late 80s is like almost the greatest band of like the George Best era Wedding Present, if that counts.
Sure. Yeah, the Wedding Present are great.
And I'm just looking at some acts here under C86. Maybe I don't know a lot of these acts. The Field Mice I really like. There's a certain like, they seem to invoke the landscape of the Field Mice in a way that I quite like. But don't get me wrong, this is good. I just it felt like another example. I didn't pull the genre in a way that and it's good that I was reminded of Close Lobsters here, whereas that had more of an impact on me actually.
Oh yeah, that album's awesome.
Yeah, I like how you showed me a video of them playing recently. They're having a really good time.
They're all probably in like their 50s, and they're still rocking it.
I remember one time I quite enjoyed. There's a Sarah Records compilation from the '90s, which has a red cover, and that was really good because you get a bunch of different acts on there. You do get an inherent amount of variety, a really good amount of variety. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's an interesting
more
scene.
than one group can offer, I think.
Mm.
But it's good stuff, and it's no. This group doesn't have an official studio album. It's just there's an EP called "You Should All Be Murdered," free songs. And then that horse riding song is one of the tracks on there actually. Is part of the reason you thought to pick this because the opening track is Anorak City.
It actually yes. It was because I was listening to this album for the first time in quite a while recently. Then I remembered that the opening track is called Anorak City.
Yeah.
And so I was like, yeah, fuck it.
Nice.
I'm gonna put the other Anorak on there.
Hell yeah. Yeah.
That's a classic song too. That's a little catchy number. That's the other thing. The songs don't overstay their welcome. Like none of them are that long.
No.
That's the good thing about Django Pop. They understood the pop aspect of having a 2.5 to 3 minute song. And it's just interesting how they have to cram in all these like, verse and chorus bridge changes and everything into such a short song. The most typical example I always cite, because people are sometimes like, oh, that song would be the greatest song ever if it went for longer than 1 minute and 50 seconds, is Please, Please, Please Let Me Get What I Want by the Smiths. Yeah. It's like, nah, 1 minute and 50 seconds, perfect. Like, it doesn't overstay its welcome. If you want the 3-minute version of that song, listen to Girlfriend in a Coma. It's kind of the 3-minute equivalent. It's different, but similar, So there is definitely that, the punctuality of it is key. Similar to, as well, something like Suburban Lawns, 2.5 minute songs. The Minutemen, or like that infamous thing where the guy from the Pixies was like, if it's good enough for like Buddy Holly, it's good enough for me.
Yeah, that's a good
2.5 minute,
Yeah, I think there's just Frank Black to Gil Norton, I believe that in exchange is...
Okay, yeah.
It's production.
To Gil Norton, yeah, sure, yeah.
Another Django Pop act I'm listed under here, I can never resonate with me quite as heavily. Go-Betweens. I think something about though this is good. I did like this more than the Go-Betweens album we discussed some weeks ago, or maybe a couple months ago now.
That album, so stark.
And the thing is the sound's very, I don't know, like light and feathery, if you know what, in terms of the sonic and the production.
Yeah,
definitely. I mean, the Smiths have a kind of a bigger, bassier sound.
No, certainly, yeah.
And Aztec Camera have a bigger sound.
And once again, those are,
big
they're using like professional studios.
Yeah. But the Fieldmeister, I said they were landscapey. The Triffids are good and landscapey too. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So maybe that's
they
kind
have
of where I gravitate more so.
The Triffids have a good organ sound as well.
That's true.
But yeah, no, the Triffids go into they turn Jangle into almost like a math rocky thing, you know.
Yeah, nice.
Whereas someone like the Go-Betweens, like doing like a blues jangle mixed with like, I don't know, Lou Reed or something. A Bohemian thing, right? Which is also the Bohemian thing is the Triffids. That's a big connection between the two. It's like they're the only like Bohemian Australian groups in that era.
Yeah, nice.
Or during the mid '80s, like beat revival thing.
Yeah. But no, good stuff. Positive reception and response for me here.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the opposite of lo-fi, Steve Lillywhite.
1981, October. Well, U2, like it's... I was kind of just I knew U2 from like the big songs from the 2000s and all the sort of like just Sunday Bloody Sunday. I was in the 80s, but like, just these big songs, big bland arena songs. I always thought they were corny. And,
Sure.
for them. Then, I get into post-punk later, and eventually like there is a sort of fascination I kind of detect. Eventually I got into like early Cure after not liking the big later Cure singles, and I still don't really care for them that very much. Would still detest them, the sort of late 80s and the 90s onward stuff.
Yeah.
And then I wondered if they could make the same move with you too, like out of Simple Minds as well, And so I'm exploring Boy in October, and yeah, I do find a lot to appreciate about both of these pieces, and in particular, I find myself compelled with October because you have these very youngish guys, like no one's older than 25 on here, right? So I'm just going to assume, and they really want to make this big sort of spiritual, ethereal, earthy music. It's like, I just imagine this sort of Irish context and what like a sort of church, like, which is just, and if you're raised in like a Catholic context, it's like, and I was one of the last people to be raised in a properly Catholic context, arguably. Or just because the times, you know what I mean?
No, post-Vatican II, definitely not real Catholic. Mel Gibson was he was the last.
Well, of that sort of... there was something of a thing post-Vatican II.
He's
like,
the Catholic road warrior.
Jeez. Oh, man.
In the secular wasteland.
Very passionate guy. But no, just the idea of like... and. These sort of guys, like I'm just feeling the sort of spiritual presence in the environment around them. In manner similar to how the Water Boys invoke on their records in the first three in the 80s there, around this time, a little bit later, and there's such a kind of a seriousness and a sincerity to how they want to like. Compose and put this music out, and then the recording ethos, and I keep finding myself coming back to it for that reason, and just also because, wow, I find that so many of the songs on here are just very re-listenable and catchy. I mean, the chorus of Glory is a bit much, but like just every other part of the song is tremendously enjoyable. I love I Fall Down. I threw a brick for a windows. That's just extraordinary. I love Rejoice. I just love the post-punk riffing, the drumming, and they're innovated by other groups, but like they execute it very slickly.
They have a unique take on it, definitely. Which like honestly, the thing that like probably holds U2 back most in my mind is that like they tried to be like a pop band, always. They wanted to be the biggest band in the world, right? They wanted to be like similar to like Phil Collins or something like that, rule the whole entertainment like hill, be king of the hill or something, right? Which because of that they were able to achieve, or they had to have sort of, you know, like interesting new ideas like guitar work and shit like that. Like the Edge's guitar stuff is like a unique take on, you know, the like post-punk sort of magazine and sushi thing, and they were pretty contemporaneous to it. And there are certain like passages on this album when it's being like instrumental, and at least like if you don't have Bono singing on it, which maybe it just might be subjective to me, but Bono sort of lets the album down in a weird way, where like if they had have gone in the like maybe once again it's just my subjective taste, like evidently U2 isn't this, but like that sort of guitar work and instrumental passages, they would have been doing like Durruti Column-esque stuff and got into post rock before, you know, the like Talk did, right? And like they apparently wanted to replicate on like Acton Baby.
Yeah.
And like they were already doing that though around this time, but they just had to like shoehorn it into like pop songs, or at least like the best parts of the album are when they're less like formally structured songs, and it's just like spiritual ruminations, or like, you know, Bono just like yelping something that's meant to be like a sort of feeling or something like that. And unlike later U2, it feels a bit more real, you know, where he's sort of coming from on moments of this album. Definitely. But there's just a weird part in my mind where, like, I have a weird associative thing with U2, for example, where, like, you said you were, say, the last person raised Catholic.
Oh, what I mean by that is like it's hard to have that sort of like sort of untainted view of the world, like where it's just like this sort of like that sort of that's your cosmology, you know what I mean? Like pre sort of internet being everywhere.
But I think like more specifically, you might be amongst the last people, right?
Yeah, that's more fair to say.
I went to a Catholic high school, and there was this guy, I forget his name, but his one thing, at least when it came to music, was that like U2.
Yeah.
Just loved U2. And I just remember one time, it was at like some school camp or something in like later school, and he puts on like, it was like or it was probably even like a party or something in like late high school, and he puts on With or Without You on the speakers and just like sits there and like, in an evangelical sense, just like letting the spirit in, like with his arms outstretched, you know?
Wow.
And I'm just, like I was saying earlier with Steve Hogarth doing like the Yelp, it reminded me of Bono on this. And there's just like, just strange like I guess, because they're like Irish, they're like pretty Catholic, right?
That happens.
But to me, it feels almost like an 80s like new age sort of thing, right? Like new age internationalist like spiritualism, more so than like a sort of classical Catholicism.
Oh, on this album, or
yeah. Because like maybe I don't get references or something. Even something like Jerusalem feels more like it's referencing like England, you know.
Well, yeah,
infamously having Jerusalem as like their sort of like one of their national songs, right?
Yeah.
And like I guess politically, it's probably a bit conscious as well, because infamously, you know, a lot of Irish people aren't that fond of England, and like there is sort of some sort of like tasteful disdain artistically expressed on on this album, definitely. It's probably some of the best U2 I've heard. Like I said, I just personally wish if they went in like the Durruti Column sort of direction, like they would have been really on the vanguard of like interesting post rock, right? They would have been right there, like inventing it, you know. But their ambition was to be the biggest band in the world, and I suppose they achieved that. But you know, obviously later on they sort of like, you can never be the biggest band in the world and do it by being cutting edge and then maintain that, you know.
Seemingly, yeah.
It can't happen, and so you just have to fall into this like sellout mentality, really, you know. It happens to all the greats, or it did, you know. who became really popular.
I mean, their quest to do so was, I found it at least effective artistically here because there's just abundance of hooks. I find, at least I think I find them very highly engaging. Like, remember there's that track Rejoice, I love that. Fires in there, it's just that powerful riffing there. And then the slower tracks, like, they can be a bit, like, shouldn't be 4 minutes, but, like, I do kind of feel that song. Like, there is something, like, it feels like that sort of, like, the Catholicism of, like, my dad's generation. And like people who took it seriously, and like I think when Catholicism as opposed to like sort of mainstream Protestantism, it's really like sort of like, you know, I don't know that other groups don't do this, but like they really hammer in the sort of like just the sort of like mortality and sort of you know, fear and like sort of the ancient sort of like and like interactions with God, you know, miracles, saints, things like that. There is something like it's almost I don't know if it's truly able to describe what that feels like, but like kind of like it's not something I would have been able to take very seriously beyond like age 10 or whatever. Don't get me wrong, like it is like conducive to like being very young as well, and like sort of like a child's potentially more elastically romantic view of the world anyway, but I feel like it makes me think of that, which makes me think they kind of felt that too, being in Ireland and just like sitting on like just there's no, so much of a cliche for Mandala so far, but like there's no internet yet, and there's just like the world is just outside and just these stories that people tell, and you know, just going outside is like the zenith of everything at that point. It's not like you can get a, you know, the superior knowledge is, you know, we have to go to individual books, not just like a collection of, you know, just flat screen digital library, which is a kind of ultimate sort of perverse taxonomy anyway. Tomorrow, and then October, that's the 2-minute one, that's the shorter. October, I like those, they're pretty. I wish they were next to each other though. It's weird for the sequencing, we talked about sequencing earlier.
Yeah.
You know, I love with Shout Jerusalem. It's just like kind of playfully Deus Fold. I don't know, whatever. Fuck it. And Stranger in a Strange Land's a lot of fun. Scarlet's nice, good instrumental. That's sort of where your Dirty Column thing's coming from a little bit.
Yeah.
And then
what's with English bands and taking the title of a Heinlein book and then it having nothing to do with the novel?
I suppose I know Maiden's the only other one who do that. Is there another one like I'm not thinking of?
No, but two's enough.
Two's enough. Well, just Irish and English. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
British Isles.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Bono.
Yeah, and then is that all like really dig? You know, sing a song makes me angry. I love his vocals on this album. They're just very.
I have been ripping into Bono, but like apparently Bono, at least before around this era, before he got like really famous, was apparently a really like modest, nice guy. That's weird to think about in, you know, the context of how he's known as like a, you know, pervasive narcissist, like rock star sort of thing, right?
Yeah, you know what the interesting backstory about the October is they were touring America briefly, I think, after Boy, and Bono had a big briefcase full of ideas and musically and I guess more lyrically, thematically, that he wanted to incorporate within the next album. He said the theme of Boy was childhood, and the theme of October was going to be religion or spirituality or God, whichever. And they lost the briefcase on the tour.
Oh, wow.
And so they go back to England and they're in kind of panic mode. And apparently, like, there's this one of the band members described the sessions like Steve Lillywhite pacing back and forth, stressed. They weren't able to achieve as complex a drum sound as the first one. I like the drum sound of this a lot, but it's more like kind of straightforward. It doesn't feel as produced as Boy, but it's clearly very hi-fi.
Yeah.
Boy's got a lot more of those bells and whistles and things on it. I like Boy quite a bit, but I think I like this one. This would be the best, my pick for best U2 album by default, I guess. I think, yeah. And so Bono had to improvise a lot of it on the spot based upon what he kind of wanted to do, but kind of more of a direct, I guess, way, you know, because you have to go from memory and you sort of just like pull them together on the spot rather than going for these elaborate sort of Baroque notes that you might have had. And maybe makes the album more interesting in that way. And
the production is like definitely the key carrying factor of the album. Like it yeah, like you said, maybe the first album has that sort of more distinct drum sound, but like the guitar seems central to this album, you know, and it's so spacious and like yeah, the sort of landscapes that come from it is definitely like at least to me, the foundational enjoyment I get from it, you know. It's a cool take on like post-punk guitar work, and mixed in with like some moments of like genuine like meditative songwriting lyrically and stuff like that, and some good bass work, to be honest.
oh, they're brilliant, yeah.
But yeah, definitely mostly that sort of gloomy, like it's in a vacuum sort of like oscillating guitar sound, you know, that, like I said earlier, like the Chameleons infamously did later on, or at least like
Inspired by you two.
Yeah, well, they have a song called "The Fan That Bellows." It sort of sounds like a bit more straightforward version of the riffing on like the Jerusalem song.
Yeah. But you know, I can easily imagine like being a kid, like under the age of 10 in 1981, and listening to this on an LP and thinking like, "Wow, this is so spiritual." These like, you know, older, youngish guys have like a very dense sort of understanding of the world. You know, it's in that sort of it's in that sort of realm. At least I can imagine. Even if I'd heard of this, like, I mean, you two were too established by the time I would have been able to hear it, you know, so it wouldn't have the same effect. It would have just been like a U2 album. But like when this was like the newest album from the band, and you were like you know, this is say like one of the only things is, you know, you haven't been exposed to much music, you would have thought this was like so legendary. At least that's how I feel about like my own subjective reality. Like,
Sure.
Exposed to it. It's something that makes you think of like, I don't know, like old churches in like the suburbs, like Parramatta or something. I don't know. As a weird
Yeah, well, they wanted it, like you said, a 10-year-old or something. Hence the sort of wanting to be the biggest band in the world. This is the sort of thing where they're taking like Joy Division or the Durruti Column.
Oh yeah.
Bay City Rollersifying it.
Well, I
you
find
know
that
what
impressive, actually.
And
yeah.
it's successful at that. But like you said, you have to, I suppose, or at least like the situation you described, I'd have to like contrive that feeling, you know, because it like I wasn't a kid at that time.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I wasn't 10 years old, and like you said, you two, when at least I was 10 years old, was not this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas definitely at the time, like it I suppose that's what I meant almost by like pseudo spiritual earlier. Is like I feel like it's a sort of more consumable rumination on the sort of like meditative sort of stuff that around this era, like say with Hitchcock or like the Chameleons, the Chameleons, is a bit more like it's not naive. It's a bit more like I said, nihilist earlier, not in the sense of like past adolescence and like being able to understand like the sort of qualities of like a sort of less conformist worldview of something like you know the obeying you have to do to an interventionist god or something like that, you know, which seems very, when you're at the age of 10, like an interventionist god seems a bit more able to realize, you know, a bit more naive.
Oh
you
yeah,
know?
definitely.
Which is definitely the quality of this album, I suppose. And I don't mean to deride YouTube by saying that Bay City Rollerifying those sort of spiritual ruminations, but like I guess I'm just like sort of theorizing on the fly, you know.
I guess, well, when I say when I imagine being in the context of, like, say, youngish, under 10 in 1981, here to whatever, hearing this, it's not that, this isn't something I can automatically do with any album, it's something that is
more particular. Yeah, no, definitely.
I can't necessarily do that for, like, say, Susie and the Banshees or or some Cure album from around that time. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe if I consciously do so, I can like, all right, yeah, Faith by the Cure, and I'm under 10 in 81, I guess. But like this because this is, I guess it's a mood that makes me think of when I was like under 10. I sort of like, I guess you call it a naive Catholicism, because I mean, if I didn't think it was slightly naive, I'd still probably adopt it more, with more conviction. But so there's maybe something to that. It's just there's, I feel like there's a power here, and it's evoked on other groups' albums, like we mentioned Ocean Rainbow and the Bunnymen earlier. That makes you think of like kind of Childhood Wonder and Majesty, and sort of that late 90s ABC Kids grandeur. I don't know why. And then obviously those Waterboys albums.
Well, that album was apparently
a couple of Chameleons, or maybe all those Chameleons ones, and plus Sun and the Moon.
Yeah, that's a good album.
Yeah, that's U2 October. I really dig this. I dig it a lot. I know we can talk about other superior things even, but I appreciate this one as well. And like, you know, U2 afterward, it is what it is. Unforgettable Fire isn't so bad, but
No, Rattle and the Hum is the peak.
I mean, no one likes Rattle and Hum.
How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb.
Oh yeah. You might not want to, and you have to listen to that thing.
Yeah.
That's too easy. I'm
But
sorry.
yeah, no, this album is evidence that there was a time when Bono was like a nice guy. Which is a pretty powerful artistic statement, to be honest.
Well,
or at least it's meta.
Yeah. Right.
It's
Right.
like in the sense of an album capturing a moment in time of when sessions are recorded, you know.
Yeah.
Which
Speaking of 1981.
Yeah.
Yes.
same year. Damn, that's crazy. YMO, Technodelic. Man, this is a whole thing, I suppose. I guess I picked this one because you mentioned previously you were going to pick your last one, which is Electric Cafe with Kraftwerk.
Yeah.
Which for some reason in reissues is called Techno Pop. I don't know why.
Huh.
That's a weird thing. Because that's just a track on the album.
Yeah.
But anyway, this album I guess is a case of sort of YMO who were like sort of came up after Kraftwerk, right? And they're sort of like the early Japanese like synth pop sort of analogous group, right?
Yeah, their first album's 78.
Yeah. But by like this album and I guess another album, BGM, the same year, they go into the sort of they completely move into the 80s. I suppose similar to Kraftwerk with Computer World.
Yeah.
Which is 1980, right?
One.
Okay, also 81. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So yeah, no, this is an album that like they're really moving into the 80s and like keeping up with the tech seemingly, because like I didn't realize till recently how much this album is apparently built off like loops from like one of the first ever like analog sampler things that some like Japanese company invented.
Yeah.
And that sort of feels evident in like the composition of all these songs, because they're like these sort of like laid back funk grooves done with these like hard hitting sort of drum machines mixed in with like looping like melodies and like swaths of like interesting analog sort of synth like crescendoing parts and stuff. But then there's always this like weirdly like there's a few vocal tracks on the album where they sing, and it is kind of like I don't know, reminiscent of like late 60s British psychedelia, like backwoods recordings and like reverb vocals, but it's like sort of an electro version. But then a lot of it's like just like these like walkie-talkie radios and stuff like that. And the way all that stuff mixes into these sort of like hypnotic, groovy, like rhythmic songs I don't know. I just find this album's like strangely, like reminiscent of its title, right? It puts you in this weird space of like early 80s, sort of like home computer rise sort of stuff mixed in with that a very realized late 60s psychedelic approach. and sort of is almost like a genesis moment of like the whole psychedelic movement, because it's just before the internet as well.
Yeah.
And there's a few tracks on here that like, I suppose the walkie-talkie aspect of it is because like, I don't know, they're sort of like Cold War-esque theme songs about like, you know, Korea and stuff like that in the Japanese sphere, like, you know, Russia as well. And it's almost like a very 1981. It also falls into like that sort of nuclear wave thing as well.
Yeah.
Similar to your first pick, once again, actually, the Hitchcock album. That album was also nuclear wave. There's so much in that genre. It was such a purveying like part of the zeitgeist, of course, right?
Yeah.
And so you sort of get that. It reflects in this like almost like pre-industrial like dance music, you know. This album is a bunch of strange like electronic experiments that is like weirdly ahead of its time.
Yeah.
Like it might not be quite fully realized yet because the technology's not quite there. But I find it how fascinating they can make a really compelling recording right on the cutting edge of this technology. And there's one of the tracks on this album, I think it's called like Graded Grey. When I listen to that, I'm like, man, I wonder if the guy from Japan was, what's his
David
name?
Sylvain.
Yeah, Sylvian was like listening to this album when
Maybe,
they
yeah.
decided to go in like a similar direction, right? And then I'm like, wait, the band's called Japan. Like, of course he would have listened to YMO.
They've collaborated,
And then-
I'm pretty sure, with him and Sakamoto.
And then, yeah, I remember Sakamoto did a collab with him later. So it's like, surely he was a fan of YMO. So it's interesting how there's this sort of weird, like, Bermuda Triangle of electronic music of, like, you know, London, Berlin, and Japan.
Yeah.
And weirdly influencing each other. And New York to some degree as well. Sometimes get involved in this world. But,
Oh, nice. Isosceles Triangle, right?
yeah. Would be a weird, like, rhombus if you want to really count New York. Because there'd be four points.
Yeah.
But yeah, this album is like such a distinct sort of contribution to that whole world. And weirdly, like, reflective of so much more music that like came along later and really is downstream of this, like, because I don't know, there are albums before this besides maybe BMG as well, which infamously I think was like one of the earliest albums to have the 808 drum machine on it.
Probably.
Is like them really like pushing new territory, whereas the earlier albums are like, you know, sort of post Kraftwerk synth pop mixed with a bit of that sort of world of you know, city pop or Japanese jazz fusion from the late 70s.
Yeah.
Whereas this and BMG feel like the YMO are fully like inventing a realized new music, you know. And yeah, I guess this is just an album that I can't help but kind of like really love. It's just like, yeah, I could only imagine listening to this whilst like under a psychedelic experience, whilst like, I don't know, using a VR headset or something. So it'd be truly technodelic.
Yeah. The YMO albums from like the first one, 78, well in particular the 79 remixes album, up until like I really like Naughty Boys in 83, like that. This run there, Solid State Survivor, BGM, Technodelic, the aforementioned Naughty Boys. Amazing.
Yeah.
Like, few groups can match that. That's just so spellbinding, so creative, so influential, so just experimental and innovative. And Technodelic is obviously no exception. You know, Technodelic, it makes me think, sometimes there's this idea that there was the 60s, then there was the 70s, then it petered out into the electronic sterile 80s, and it's just like, no, like the electronic, that this is, it's moving into that sort of organic 90s cyberdelia, like the sort of like hippie-delic fascination with altered states doesn't dissipate in the 70s. It kind of moves through strange new different places throughout the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s to now in the 20s, and I feel like a new time level to be sort of arranged and composed, which places 80s electronic sounds as like an organic move from you know, the more long form prog or free jazz stuff of the 70s, you know, I feel like it's, you know, you can put even the punk and the post-punk belongs there, because I feel like, you know, rock in its kind of primordial form is considered very sort of countercultural, and I feel like to sort of dissect that the initial mid late 70s punk explosion from that narrative is itself kind of, well, it just doesn't seem not entirely accurate, and anyway, so I guess the point I'm making is when you get to the highly technological sort of cliche 80s, like I don't, part of that cultural omnipotence I was referring to earlier, or omnipresence rather, is I like the idea of thinking that getting to a point where one is so knowledgeable about and so personally imbued with music releases, or, you know, film developments in cinema in each decade, and culture in general, that the arts, that they consider like each, because everyone, let's say someone thinks like the 70s is a zenith of cinema or music or whatever, they must think that like each decade was better than the one before that up until the 70s. And the 80s people think every decade was the best up until the 80s, when the 90s was worse, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, well,
and
rock music in the 70s being the greatest thing ever is probably like a narrative construction of like Rolling Stone magazine and the whole rockist movement, right?
Yeah.
Rockism movement or whatever.
Seems that way, yeah. And that's
I don't think it's a
narrative.
I don't think it's a world view that many people take seriously outside of, like, it's an echo chamber, right?
Yeah. And so, like, that's kind of what I'm excited about, the idea that, like, each decade was more exciting than the last.
Yeah.
You just kind of need to know where to look.
You know, well, naturally, yeah, of
if
course.
you were around in, like, even if you were around in the 70s, and people were around in the 70s, but
I think that's
they
why...
didn't know everything that was around.
I think that's why I like the movie Back to the Future as a kid. Because I would have watched it in, like, the mid-2000s a bunch of times. And it's a movie set in the mid-80s. Yeah. About a guy going back to the mid-50s. So there's this weird, like, 30-year formula to it. Yeah. And that's almost like the purveying, this sort of strange take on nostalgia and contemporaneous, like, supremacy, let's say. Yeah. Is almost like the theory of Back to the Future in a weird way, you know? Like, especially when he goes back to the 50s and is, you know... It's not hyper-idealized. No. It's a grimy, it's not that idyllic place, 50s, just like the 80s. You know?
It's closer to that Last Picture Show 50s.
And the only, like, difference between... Like, and he understands the raw reality of the world better than his dad does, you know?
Yeah.
But the main part of culture shock is this just, like, superficial pop cultural paradigm. Like, you know, Ronald Reagan being the president, or him having seen the episode of, like, The Honeymooners or whatever, you know? Like, what? Whoever goes to is like the spaceman, and it's like, it's brand new. What's a rerun? There's a strange sort of paradigm there where that movie's almost about how, like, the contemporary really is the place to be, especially not the Wild West.
Well, better not to make that movie in the first place.
But yeah, this sort of, like, cutting-edge synth-pop music is, so emblematic of that idea, especially at that time, right? Like, Computer World, or even, like, if you're done with Technodelic, the next pick.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Electric Cafe, Kraftwerk. So the Kraftwerk narrative goes as follows. You know, people give lip service to the first two albums, but I don't know if they hold them in major esteem. I think even if there's no albums after Kraftwerk 2, I think those are two brilliant, odd little krautrock classics.
And hardcore,
many of them out there.
The hardcore Kraftwerk fans seem to like Ralph and Florian as well.
That's a really good album, and that belongs to the canon, I think, in people's minds. Autobahn and Radioactivity, the Kibbut Hat. Those are my two favorites actually in all of the Kraftwerk.
Yeah,
Radioactivity is my personal favorite.
Sure, yeah. No, they're all of this run of Kraftwerk is great.
Yeah.
Great.
Talking about YMO being great. I mean, this is the forerunner to it, quite obviously.
Yeah, the forerunner, and they do last a pretty significant amount of time. And then that's where you get to, say, this album, which is like an outlier in a way, but like a lovable outlier. I don't know.
Yeah, because we go to Trans Europa Express, Dimension Machine, Computer Welt.
Yeah.
And then in 1986, and this is the biggest gap since ever so far.
Yeah.
81 to 86, and apparently they're working on this for a long time. There are stories about how they heard Blue Monday and they tried to replicate it in a studio and were concerned that they couldn't. Like I guess the sort of feel of it without imitating it.
Sure.
You know
Yeah.
what I mean.
Like a newer electro dance.
And so Electric Cafe is a weird mix of Kraftwerk trying to organically move on from Computer World whilst keeping up with all the other acts who kind of are catching up to them now, because now it's not just their thing, and not only them have access to the technology now. And they try to have the most hi-fi technology, but it doesn't make much of a difference when a lot of the popular electronic music is based around very intense melodies in the mainstream sense, or in the club sense, these very hard rhythms, like high energy, or now house and techno at this point.
According to Wolfgang, they had like the most top of the line synthesizers and stuff at this time, but they just rather than like, I don't know, traditionally experimenting through like trial and error, they would just like read the manuals of the technology and try to modulate all this sounds like in a very meticulous manner.
Mm-hmm.
Like, according to Wolfgang, one of the members, like, they sort of fell out of love with music around this time.
Yeah.
Which, like, there are certain elements of this album that, like, on the surface level, they feel tired, especially from, like, a fan of Kraftwerk, someone who's listened to all the other albums and then get to this one.
Yeah.
But there's a weirdly, like, charming, like, lovable sort of character under the surface to this album. I don't know.
I think so, too.
They come across as human for the first time. Maybe that's it.
Maybe, yeah.
The robots are finally human.
There's something very... compositionally, it goes for a more sort of static and binary sort of trance-like sound. And in Computer World is very intensive and sort of, very populated, you know what I mean? With sonics and
funk rhythms. It invented electro, essentially.
This was very sparse by comparison.
Definitely, yeah. More industrial.
Yeah, and slightly minimal and sort of sort of reflecting sort of what their understanding of like contemporary sort of what would you call it, like these cult like movements in a dance club at that time listening to electronic music, and they're trying to reflect that seemingly, and they do a fascinating imitation / parody of it. And but I guess sometimes one wonders, like, because it's not as elaborate, is it as intricate, in depth, for experimental as it was as the earlier stuff? And like, yeah, I'm not sure if it is, but I think it's embodying some. It's effectively the equivalent of like very refined minimalist art pop. Like it's sort of this. Yeah, I think the irony and the the telephone call and sex object seem to indicate that they're more operating in a world of making music for people who are kind of like them, these sort of tech heads who appreciate maybe the idea of pop music that want a bit more intelligence to it, and it's sort of mocking the concept of upbeat, up-tempo electronic dance-oriented music in the first place, saying just the banality of the lyrics, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
because it's supposed to be about technology. I mean, it's still about technology, but in more of a it's like it's less passionate. It's more dispassionate and detached this time around.
Well, that's where the human aspect of this album comes
compared
in.
to Computer Love.
Yeah, definitely something like Sex Object as well. For example, is like trying to be weirdly like provocative, in the sense of, I don't know, trying to sort of take on that aristocratic celebrity culture that was very prominent in Europe at the time. That according to that biography that Wolfgang wrote was like they flirted with and stuff like that, and it feels like it comes from that world definitely, the sort of fashion magazine world, and it's just sort of like a rather sort of like stark, deliberately like like they're using the formula of their old like robotic songs, but this time it's about being a human.
Yeah.
And the phone call one's weird as well because that's a really good song. I actually love that song. That song's so good, and I love how they, yeah, it's similar to like say something like it's very human like the that song by Something to Say by
Telex.
Yeah, by Telex. It's like that where it's like this weirdly like ghost in the machine, like human consciousness being like reduced to sort of like mechanical processes, like a telephone call, for example, or waiting for the yearning that came back in the day before mobile phones of like waiting for phone calls from people, and just the way it incorporates that sort of like emotional human thing with the mechanical, like like something like you think would be in a novelty song, like mixing in the rotary phone noises, and the your hold on the line or whatever, and all the telephone noises. They mix in such a weirdly like natural way for something that would be in a novelty song too.
Yeah, it's like a song from the future, and this technology's been around for a long time now, and they've done a song about it. You know what I mean? It's like a song about writing a letter.
Yeah, and I love that in German or English, it uses the like localized operator voice.
Okay.
So when you listen to the album in German, it's like and I'm like, yeah, man. It's kind of cool that they did that. They mixed the sample. They made it region appropriate. That's another interesting thing. That's the weird deep side of Kraftwerk when you listen to all the different regional versions.
Yeah.
Because it's interesting how they put the different variations on the songs depending on where they were going to release the album. Not many groups would do that. Very few. Like the Beatles, I guess, infamously.
Peter Gabriel.
And like Peter Gabriel had German ones as well, yeah. But, Kraftwerk, and it doesn't matter if you listen to their songs in English or German as well, like, besides the variations, they still come across the same way. I find that kind of fascinating.
Yeah, some of them I distinctly prefer in English just because I just know them as that, and plus, like, I like the irony comes across better to me in English, obviously.
Sure.
Like, home computer, and,
that's
calculator, the model...
Yeah.
The robots.
That is a key difference to the recordings, yeah. Like, perhaps there is that sort of ironic sensibility with the German. I'm not sure, because I can't understand the accents and stuff. But they do definitely do that in... Maybe because English wasn't their first language, though they were probably very fluent English speakers, but they're able to almost remove their accent and utilize this, like, transatlantic, like, ironic monotone, And, that does come across more in the English recordings, at least to me, but maybe to a German listener too. I'd have to ask. I'm kind of fascinated by that now, actually.
It sounds like I think of like the robots. It's like an Americanized European, like the sound of like one of those Hollywood producers, or like Michael Curtiz would have sounded like.
Yeah.
You think about Derek von Stroheim.
Yeah.
The Butler.
As opposed to like Werner Herzog, whose like English is like heavily accented, which is always hilarious.
He loves the beers, and the beers love him.
Such a thick accent.
I like your cafe. Like, honestly, I mean, it's poppier than some of the other Kraftwerk records, but it's still that same sort of spacey. Like, this is them doing something closer to like someone like Eno, right? Like when Eno does pop.
Sure.
And I just it's which is to say it's in this sort of odd. Yeah, it's just it's kind of pop music for the sort of tech, computer whiz head people, and that's And I think the thing about Electric Cafe, there's such a, it's very optimistic about 1986, because if this is like, considered like, disappointing in the context of 1986, so has to say about 1986 is so enormously invigorating and imaginative, which in musically, in the electronic realm, that something like Electric Cafe can be considered, passe. But it's extraordinarily entertaining. I never have a very dull time listening to it. I find it as listenable and gratifying as any of their other releases. And the mix, which is the remix album, now considered part of the canon in '91, that's very good.
Yeah.
The Tour de France soundtracks as an album in 2003, it's very, very good too. Maybe even better than Electric Cafe, but I like Electric Cafe is magnificent.
Oh, it's a true like dark horse. Like honestly, it doesn't get the appreciation it probably deserves. Though that is almost like its nature in a weird way.
Well, something cutting edge in the electronic field in 1986, or at least very fresh at 1986. Say something like Test Department's Unacceptable Face of Freedom, where like that was like totally, that's the kind of the equivalent of like what, not necessarily hi-fi, but like like something so just like brand new.
Yeah,
like just equivalent to like Kraftwerk doing Trans Europe Express, like,
as well as
10
like
years before that.
house music and techno. Then around '86 is starting to become.
Think about New Order's Brotherhood, what that intensity release.
Yeah, there's a lot on that, definitely. But, yeah, like, this is on something like the dawning of... Well, like, synth pop has moved on, sort of, by this time. Which is, I guess why this album might be overlooked. But, yeah, there's some quality songs on here. And it, yeah, it's a surprisingly overlooked album for a Kraftwerk album.
Well, think about Computer World. Like, when... At that time, other acts doing similar music were essentially just doing Kraftwerk. By 1986, that didn't necessarily mean doing Kraftwerk anymore. And so it was Kraftwerk almost trying to do everyone else.
Rock, Planet Rock, don't stop.
The Electric Cafe, the final track, that sort of feminine vocal that comes in to go, Electric Cafe. Oh, that's one of the most beautiful moments in the discography.
Yeah, it's like a robot. It's like a Siri voice or something.
Yeah, oh my gosh. This is a reptilian girlfriend.
Yeah, some conspiracy nuts, like schizophrenic, like social connection or something. Yeah, Electric Cafe is a bit like that, but by nature, I mean, that's some cutting edge CGI work on the cover.
Wow, it's brilliant.
It actually is. Like, that was like, they full on got like the best CGI people in Europe to make that. Like, that was cutting edge.
Yeah, it makes you think, you mentioned Back to the Future earlier, it doesn't make you think of the Max Headroom heads in...
it's a bit like that. Cafe. And there's a music video for Boom Boom.
Oh, sure,
whatever it's called, which has the heads being animated and stuff, which is kind of fascinating.
I mean, like the Max phenomenon,
Yeah.
God. No, so as of today, Electric Cafe is officially part of. It's no longer the odd one out. It's they're all from now on, like all 11 of these Kraftwerk albums are major classics, and it's one of the top discographies of all time. No blemishes. We've cleared all this fuzziness up. Electric Cafes belongs now. No need to discuss anymore.
Yeah, it's a shame they got into cycling.
I guess so. I mean, like if you do some great music, you have a right to just kind of move on from it, rather than put a potential blemish on the discography, which just people thought of Electric Cafe as that blemish, but I believe wrongly so.
Yeah. I do recommend, honestly, most like music biographies I've read aren't that good, but that Wolfgang Flür guy had a kind of interesting one, because like at least he set up like the sort of social dynamic of Kraftwerk, which I never even would have assumed existed. You wouldn't think of like Kraftwerk as like this, because performatively they're always like robots and stuff.
In unison, sort of in alignment.
Yeah, but apparently there was like the Wolfgang guy lays out this strange like dichotomy where him and Karl Bartos are like working class people, who like had to work their way into like these German art schools, and then Ralph and Florian are like these middle class people who came from like the aristocratic class, and to them like the whole thing was like some vaudeville thing, but I guess they wanted to be like, you know, sort of considered cutting edge and like you know, create the new technology or utilize the new technologies into like sort of new transcendental music like the German composers of old and stuff. And it's just weird how those sort of cultures clashed within the group. You'd never expected it out of Kraftwerk.
No, not really.
And like it got to the point where it's like some of the cattiest shit I've ever read, because like Wolfgang claims that he invented all these like drum technologies and stuff because he was like an engineer, and then the like Kraftwerk used their like managers and stuff to have the patents of his inventions owned by like Ralph and Florian or something.
Oh.
Man, the drama of Kraftwerk is like next level. You wouldn't expect it out of Kraftwerk, eh?
No, well, you know, no one was like trying to figure it out. You know, they didn't have cameras on at all times to leak it to the press. You know,
apparently the German press were pretty like onto them. Like they were, after like Autobahn was a hit in America, they were like local heroes in Germany.
I see.
Which makes sense,
Yeah,
but I don't think they got big in England until the Model became a hit in like 81 or something. Or it might have been 80, but yeah. Kraftwerk are like one of the most interesting musical groups ever, honestly. There's so much to say about them.
Artistic phenomenon of the 20th century, and partly because our idea of futuristic is very refined, like in the retro sense, because I mean our idea of futuristic does denote, as Fisher claimed, and it's probably true, a sort of retro aesthetic now, but it's not necessarily what we think is going to happen in 40 years from now. It's as opposed to it's six rockets and robots of a sort of post Star Wars, but also informed by like that sort of 80s kind of smoothed over synth pop era, which is directly inspired by the Kraftwerk aesthetic. And I think that's why when people say it's like, oh, the two most influential acts are the Beatles and Kraftwerk, it's very true, and you may have to in the long run put Kraftwerk ahead of the Beatles, because if the Beatles influence everyone for like, because the Beatles were the most influential until Kraftwerk, and who's most influential after Kraftwerk? It's hard to say, because if all music's going to be electronic from now on, like unless something surpasses that, will it ever not be Kraftwerk? Unless you want to say it's like Stockhausen, one of these earlier pioneers, but just incorporating into pop the way Kraftwerk did it was unprecedented. I mean, you had the novelty stuff like Popcorn, but just that was so basic. Like they couldn't have imagined doing what Kraftwerk did. I think all the other electronic pioneers were probably. I'd love to hear what some of these pre-Kraftwerk electronic composers felt about how they felt about the Kraftwerk releases, whether they were just like holy moly. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, I don't know much about like the Moog people,
like Morton Subotnick or the BBC Radiophonic Workshop people.
Yeah, the sort of more like concrete and
more
like, minimalist world.
Eno.
Yeah, I don't know much more about. I think Eno was a big fan. But yeah, no, definitely when Kraftwerk came along, they did change their game and inherently make, or at least start the sort of the snowballing effect of popular music moving to electronics. And yeah, we're able to realize it in such an artful way for all their albums. Like, this album's... I didn't even listen to it recently because it's just so embedded in my head. It's such a good album, and when I first got into it, I didn't realize that it was like the outlier of the canon or whatever. I didn't really know about the fan and critical consensus of the group, and I was surprised. I was like, how come it's not? It's a strangely like particular experience, this album. Just as much so as they're like, more or less like cutting edge work is.
Yeah, I just think it may have something to do with the what sounds like sparsity in comparison to the definite density of certainly Computer World and the ones before that. There's usually there's the conscious minimalism of this. There might be one single pitch being the sort of the rhythm of the song. You know what I mean? Like what sounds like a, you know, an aux cable going in now. You know, you know that might be your drum beat of the song.
Sure,
And
yeah.
That, you know, compared to computer world, it seems like you're like kind of like, wait, what?
Yeah.
To some people, but like it's, I appreciate.
Yeah, it
and
almost
enjoy what
proceeds
they
like
were going
glitch
for.
in that sense.
Yeah, it's like, and this is another one of those albums where like what they were going for, arguably, like this the idea of like this, like, you know, Kraftwerk's is kind of dense or all encompassing like 80s statement is like sort of the pioneers are coming back to show you what's what. Well, they did that, but they did it from the perspective of people who thought it was all silly, maybe, but still was aspiring to be kind of fairly creative within that industry standard. But hey, if you're listening to Mandala, chances are you're probably already familiar with Kraftwerk, and if not, like, wow, like you're gonna be on a very interesting. The rest of your year is going to be very interesting because Kraftwerk is going to be at the top of your mind if you get into that stuff. If you get into Kraftwerk, it's going to dominate your psyche for up to 10 years afterward.
Yeah, you'll be a robot.
Why not? You know, how much is good it comes of, you know, being human. You know, how good do you feel? Actually, as a robot, you don't get to feel at all, for better or for worse. I mean, yeah, pick your poison, maybe.
Oh, don't say that to Bender.